I watched my sister humiliate my children at a $20,000 birthday party, and I stayed silent just like I'd stayed silent my entire life. But my husband. He made one phone call that destroyed everything she'd ever built. "Your kids aren't important enough to be here," Victoria announced to the room full of guests. Her smile perfect, her cruelty sharper. My 12-year-old daughter's face crumbled. My 8-year-old son tried not to cry. And God help me, I just stood there frozen in the same worthless silence that had defined 37 years of being the lesser sister. But then my husband stood up. No yelling, no drama. He simply pulled out his phone, looked my sister dead in the eye, and made a call that lasted exactly 47 seconds. I didn't know who he called. I didn't know what he said. But I saw something flicker across Victoria's face, something I'd never seen before. Fear. What my family didn't know was that my boring, ordinary life was built on secrets. What my sister didn't know was that her empire, her perfect reputation, her celebrated success, her untouchable status was constructed on a foundation of lies. Lies I'd been too afraid to expose, until that moment. Because 20 years ago, my family stole something from me. Something worth millions. Something that saved their failing company and made my sister a legend. And they buried the truth so deep they forgot I was the one they'd buried with it. But I never forgot. What happened next didn't just expose my sister's fraud, it unraveled 3 decades of family secrets, triggered investigations that reached corners no one expected, and proved that the quietest person in the room can be the most dangerous. Stay with me. Because what my husband set in motion with that one phone call, none of them saw it coming. And by the end, neither will you. My name is Megan James. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my life, I've been very good at making myself smaller. As a senior consultant in organizational development, I help companies identify toxic patterns and rebuild healthy cultures, which is ironic, considering I've spent decades tolerating the most toxic pattern of all in my own family. The invitation to my niece Emma's 10th birthday party arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering. $20,000 worth of celebration my sister Victoria made sure everyone knew. The venue was a country club I couldn't have afforded to join even if I'd wanted to. When my 12-year-old daughter Lily asked if she should wear her new dress, the one we'd saved up for, I saw the hope in her eyes and told her yes, of course she'd look beautiful. My 8-year-old son Marcus wanted to bring the Lego set he'd been working on to show his cousin. I suggested he leave it at home, and the disappointment on his face made my chest tight with a familiar ache I'd learned to ignore. My husband James drove us there in our sensible Honda, not the Mercedes or BMW that filled the country club parking lot, but reliable and paid off, which mattered more to us than appearances. In the rearview mirror, I watched our children smooth their clothes nervously, and I wanted to tell them they didn't need to feel nervous, that they belonged there as much as anyone. But the truth was, I felt nervous too. I always did at family gatherings. That particular brand of anxiety that comes from knowing you're tolerated rather than welcomed, from understanding that your presence is noted primarily for its inadequacy. The party was exactly what I'd expected. White tablecloths, floral arrangements that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, a candy bar with every confection imaginable, and a professional photographer capturing every moment for Victoria's social media. My sister had orchestrated this event the way she orchestrated everything, with meticulous attention to detail and an underlying message about status and success. She stood at the center of it all in a designer dress, her smile practiced and perfect, greeting guests with the warmth she reserved for people who mattered. When we arrived, she air-kissed me without making contact, her eyes already moving past me to more important attendees. "Megan, you made it. How nice." The words were polite, but the tone carried that familiar dismissiveness I'd heard my entire life. I'd become fluent in the language of subtle rejection, the slight emphasis that communicated, "I didn't really expect you to come," the pause before my name that suggested she'd almost forgotten it. Marcus tried to hug his aunt, and she patted his head absently before turning away mid-gesture, already laughing at something someone else said. I guided my children to a table near the back, not the family table where my parents sat with Victoria's in-laws and the relatives who mattered, not the kids' table where Emma's school friends were already shrieking with excitement over the elaborate decorations. A table in the middle distance where we could observe but not quite participate. I'd perfected the art of existing in these liminal spaces, present enough to fulfill family obligation, but distant enough to avoid the worst of the comparisons and comments. The party progressed with choreographed perfection. There were performers, actual circus performers, doing acrobatics. There was a live band. There was a moment when Victoria gathered everyone for a speech about how blessed she felt to give her daughter this magical day, how important family was, how she wanted Emma to grow up, understanding the value of celebration and abundance. I clapped along with everyone else, my hands coming together mechanically, while my daughter shifted uncomfortably beside me and my son traced patterns on the tablecloth with his finger. I saw it building before it happened. Victoria's eyes kept finding me across the room, not with curiosity or affection, but with something else, something I couldn't quite name. Several times I caught her staring, and when our eyes met, she didn't look away. She held my gaze with an intensity that felt almost like a challenge, or a warning. But that didn't make sense. What did Victoria have to warn me about? I was doing what I always did, staying quiet, staying out of the way, asking nothing, causing no trouble. It was during the cake cutting that everything changed. Emma stood before her towering 5-tier masterpiece, and Victoria called all the children forward to sing. My kids looked at me for permission, and I nodded encouragingly. They joined the other children, Marcus standing on his tiptoes to see better, Lily hanging back slightly the way she did when she wasn't sure of her welcome. Victoria's voice cut through the singing, bright and clear and deliberately audible to the entire room. "Oh, not you two. This is just for the important children." She said it with a laugh as if it were a joke, but her eyes were hard, and her smile had sharp edges. The singing faltered. Other children turned to stare. My children stood frozen. Marcus's mouth still open, mid-word Lily's face draining of color. "What I mean," Victoria continued, her voice carrying that carefully calibrated tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while delivering cruelty, "is that your children aren't really important enough to be here at all. We're being generous, including them. But let's not pretend they're part of the family that actually matters." The room went absolutely silent. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. A woman coughed awkwardly. My parents, sitting at their table, looked down at their hands. My mother's lips were pressed together in that way that meant she was uncomfortable but would say nothing. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. Not a single person in that room spoke up. Not one voice rose in defense of two children who'd done nothing except exist in the wrong family position. I watched my daughter's eyes fill with tears she was desperately trying not to shed. I watched my son's face crumple and then carefully reconstruct itself into a mask of careful blankness, the same mask I'd worn for 37 years. And something inside me that had been bending for decades finally broke. But before I could find words, before I could even move, my husband stood up. James has always been a quiet man, not given to dramatic gestures or raised voices. But when he stood, every eye in that room turned to him. He didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at Victoria with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something cold and final. Then he looked at our children, at their pain and humiliation, and then at me. In his eyes I saw a question and a promise. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Still silent, still calm, he dialed a number. The room remained frozen, everyone watching this strange tableau unfold. When someone answered, James spoke just 4 words. "It's time. Do it." He ended the call, put his phone away, and extended his hands to our children. "Come on," he said gently. "We're leaving." To me, he said quietly, "Get your purse." As we walked out of that country club, Marcus's hand tight in his father's grip, and Lily pressed against my side. I glanced back once. Victoria was standing by the cake, her perfect smile finally gone, replaced by something I'd never seen on her face before. She looked afraid. In the car, neither child spoke. Lily stared out the window, tears finally sliding down her cheeks. Marcus sat very still, his small hands clenched into fists on his lap. And I understood with terrible clarity that my silence, which I'd always told myself was keeping the peace, had actually been teaching my children the most dangerous lesson of all, that they should accept being treated as less than that they should smile through humiliation, that their worth was measured by other people's willingness to acknowledge them. That single phone call James made would quietly change the course of everyone's lives, though no one at that party could have imagined how completely. Least of all my sister, who had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, not knowing that the quiet, ordinary brother-in-law she'd always dismissed had just set in motion something she would never recover from. That night, after I'd tucked Marcus and Lily into bed, both of them quiet, both of them trying to be brave, I sat in our living room and let myself remember things I'd spent decades trying to forget. James sat beside me, not speaking, just present, his hand resting on my knee. And for the first time in my adult life, I stopped pushing the memories away and let them flood back with all their sharp, painful clarity. I was 7 years old when I first understood I was the less important daughter. Victoria was 14, and she'd just won some school award I can't even remember what for now, something academic that our parents treated like a Nobel Prize. There was a celebration dinner at an expensive restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and waiters who spoke in hushed tones. I'd gotten straight A's on my report card that same week, and I remember clutching the paper in my small hands, waiting for the right moment to share my achievement too. But there was no right moment. The entire dinner revolved around Victoria, her intelligence, her promise, her bright future. When I finally timidly mentioned my report card, my mother glanced at it and said, "That's nice, sweetheart," before immediately turning back to Victoria to discuss which summer program would be best for someone of her caliber. My father didn't even look. The report card sat on the table beside my untouched dessert, and I remember thinking that maybe I hadn't done well enough, that maybe straight A's from a 7-year-old weren't as impressive as whatever Victoria had accomplished. That pattern continued for years. Victoria got piano lessons with a prestigious teacher. I taught myself to play guitar from library books because no one thought to ask if I wanted lessons too. Victoria went to expensive summer camps where she could develop her leadership potential. I stayed home or went to the local park program. When Victoria made the honor roll, there were celebrations and gifts. When I made the honor roll, which I did every semester, there were distracted compliments and immediate pivots back to whatever Victoria was doing. It wasn't that my parents were monsters. They weren't cruel or abusive in any obvious way. They simply operated under an unconscious assumption that Victoria was the daughter who mattered, the one worth investing in, and I was fine. Adequately cared for. Not neglected, just not particularly noticed. I learned to take up less space at the dinner table, to speak only when spoken to want smaller things, because wanting more only highlighted how little I received. I learned that if I didn't ask for much, I wouldn't be disappointed when I got even less. It became a survival mechanism so ingrained I didn't even recognize it as abnormal until I was much older. The worst moment, the one that should have woken me up, but instead put me into an even deeper sleep, happened when I was 17. I'd been working on a project for my business economics class, researching sustainable fashion and ethical supply chains. This was 2005, before it became trendy, when most people still thought environmentalism meant hippies and hemp. I'd developed this comprehensive business proposal, how a fashion company could implement sustainable practices while remaining profitable, complete with market analysis, showing growing consumer interest in ethical products, supply chain solutions that reduced costs long-term, and branding strategies that would appeal to conscious consumers. I was so proud of it. My teacher had given me the highest grade in the class and suggested I should consider business school. I made the mistake of showing it to my family. For once, they paid attention. My parents actually read through the entire proposal, asked detailed questions, made me explain my reasoning. Victoria, home from college for the weekend, sat through the whole presentation. My father said it was impressive. My mother called it innovative. I felt for the first time I could remember seen, valued, important. They asked if they could make copies to review more thoroughly. I said yes, thrilled that they were taking me seriously. I imagined conversations about my future, about my potential, about maybe even using the proposal somehow in the family company that I knew was struggling. A year later, I was 18 and about to start college. The family company, which had been on the verge of bankruptcy, suddenly experienced a miraculous turnaround. They'd implemented a revolutionary new business model focused on sustainable fashion and ethical supply chains. Victoria, who'd graduated with a business degree and joined the company, was credited as the visionary behind the transformation. There were articles in trade publications praising her innovative thinking. My parents glowed with pride at family gatherings, telling everyone how Victoria had single-handedly saved the company with her brilliant sustainable fashion concept. I recognized every detail, every metric, every strategy. It was my proposal word for word, in some places slightly rephrased in others. I worked up the courage to ask my mother about it one Sunday dinner. I said carefully, tentatively, "The sustainable fashion plan the company is using, that's similar to what I wrote for my class project, isn't it?" My mother looked at me with an expression I can still see perfectly in my mind's eye, not quite irritation, but close. Impatience mixed with disappointment. "Megan, don't be self-centered. These are common ideas in business right now. You think you invented sustainability. This was a family effort, a team concept that Victoria developed and refined with professional insight. Just because you wrote some high school paper doesn't mean you came up with everything." She turned back to Victoria. "Tell us more about the new supplier contracts, sweetie." I was 18 years old, and I learned in that moment that even my ideas belonged to other people. That claiming my own work made me self-centered and delusional. That speaking up didn't earn respect, it earned dismissal and correction. So I stopped speaking up. I went to college, chose a career path that wouldn't compete with Victoria's business world, married a man my family found unremarkable, and built a life quiet enough that it couldn't be compared unfavorably to my sister's achievements. I convinced myself I was happy that I'd chosen this peaceful existence, that I was above the need for recognition or validation. But I hadn't chosen peace. I'd chosen invisibility, because it was safer than being seen and found wanting. And now my children were learning the same terrible lesson, that their value depended on someone else's willingness to acknowledge it. For 37 years, Megan had perfected the art of being invisible, but watching her children learn the same painful lesson finally made her question whether silence was still a virtue or whether it had become complicity. The week after the party, I watched my children with the heightened awareness of someone who'd been blind and could suddenly see. At first, I told myself they were fine. Kids are resilient, I reasoned. They'd forget about it, move on, be okay. But they weren't okay, and I'd been telling myself comforting lies because the truth was too painful to face. Lily stopped raising her hand in class. Her teacher mentioned it casually during pickup one day, saying she'd noticed Lily had become quieter, less engaged. "Is everything all right at home?" the teacher asked with gentle concern. I assured her everything was fine, but that night at dinner, I watched my daughter push food around her plate. Her shoulders curved inward in a way that made her look smaller than her 12 years. When I complimented the essay she'd written for English class, it was genuinely excellent, creative, and thoughtful. She shrugged and said, "It's probably not that good. The other kids are better." My confident, bright daughter, who used to read her stories aloud with dramatic flair, who used to burst through the door after school bubbling with news about her day, had started apologizing for taking up space. "Sorry, I'll be quieter," she said when her brother complained about her music. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you," she said when asking me to help with homework. Sorry, sorry, sorry. As if her very existence required constant apology. Marcus changed too, but differently. He stopped talking about school entirely. When I asked about his day, he'd say, "Fine," and nothing more. I found out from another parent that he'd won an award in the school science fair, first place in his grade level for a project about renewable energy. When I asked him why he hadn't told me, he looked at his shoes and mumbled, "I didn't think it mattered." 8 years old, and already he'd learned that his achievements weren't worth celebrating, that success might actually make things worse somehow, that being noticed meant being judged and found wanting. He'd stopped showing me his drawings, stopped asking me to watch when he mastered a new skateboard trick, stopped seeking the validation that children should expect from their parents. He was learning to want less to expect, less to be less. One afternoon, I overheard Lily talking to a friend on the phone. "I can't come to your party this weekend," she was saying. "We have a family thing." But we didn't have a family thing. After she hung up, I asked her about it. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I just didn't want to go," she said quietly. When I pressed gently, she finally admitted, "What if they have cousins there? What if someone asks about our family? What if they think we're not good enough too?" My daughter was 12 years old, and she was already learning to isolate herself preemptively to avoid situations where she might be found inadequate to shrink her world so she couldn't be hurt. I was watching her become me, and the realization made me physically ill. That night, after both children were finally asleep, Marcus clutching the stuffed bear he'd supposedly outgrown Lily's light still on, because she was afraid of the dark again, a fear she'd conquered years ago. I sat alone in our kitchen and forced myself to face what I'd been running from my entire life. James was working late, and the silence of the house felt oppressive, heavy with truths I could no longer avoid. I'd told myself for decades that my silence was mature, that accepting mistreatment without complaint was the same as being diplomatic, that tolerating disrespect was just choosing my battles wisely. I'd convinced myself that maintaining family connection, even painful connection, was better than conflict, that peace was worth any price. But I'd been lying to myself. My silence wasn't mature, it was terrified. I wasn't choosing battles, I was surrendering before they even began. The peace I'd maintained wasn't real peace. It was just the absence of confrontation purchased by my willingness to absorb endless small cruelties without protest. I'd told myself I was being strong, but strength doesn't mean enduring the unendurable. Sometimes strength means saying enough. The worst realization came slowly settling over me like cold water. I'd taught my children that love requires self-erasure, that belonging means accepting whatever treatment people decide to give you, that your value is determined by other people's willingness to acknowledge it. I'd modeled surrender so completely that my children were learning to apologize for existing. What kind of adults would they become if this continued? Would Lily spend her life making herself smaller, quieter, less, always apologizing for taking up space? Would Marcus learn to hide his achievements to dim his light so he wouldn't threaten anyone to expect nothing, because wanting things only led to disappointment? Would they choose partners who treated them poorly, because that's what family felt like to them? Would they pass this same poison to their own children someday? I realized sitting in that quiet kitchen at 2 a.m. that every time I accepted disrespect, I was teaching my children to accept it too. Every time I smiled through humiliation, I was showing them that's what you do. Every time I made excuses for people who hurt us, I was telling my children that's what family means, enduring pain and calling it love. The decision didn't come as a lightning bolt or a dramatic moment of clarity. It came as something quieter and more certain. I was packing school lunches the next morning, making the sandwiches I'd made thousands of times before when I simply knew this ends now. Not with screaming or ultimatums or dramatic confrontations. Just this ends. I would not watch my children learn to live small. I would not pass this inheritance of diminishment to another generation. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan yet. But I knew with absolute clarity that I was done protecting people who'd never protected me, done maintaining peace that only I paid for, done teaching my children that their worth was negotiable. James came home that evening to find me at the kitchen table with a notebook writing. "What are you working on?" he asked. I looked up at him, this man who'd made a phone call that changed everything without my asking, who'd watched me suffer in silence for years and never pressured me to act until I was ready. "I'm making a list," I told him, "of things that need to change." He sat down across from me, and in his eyes I saw something I'd been too afraid to hope for before: complete support, no questions, no conditions. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. Megan didn't raise her voice, didn't make threats, didn't announce her intentions. She simply changed her strategy, and that quiet shift would prove more powerful than any confrontation. James looked at my notebook at the lists I was making and asked a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you know what you're actually capable of, Megan? What you've built while they weren't paying attention?" The question caught me off guard, and he must have seen the confusion on my face because he smiled slightly. "Your family thinks you settled for ordinary, but you didn't settle. You just stopped letting them see who you really are." He was right, and I'd never articulated it that way to myself before. When my family asks what I do for work, I say organizational consulting, in a tone that invites no follow-up questions. They nod politely, make a vague comment about how nice it must be to have a flexible career, and immediately change the subject. They've never asked which companies I work with, what kind of consulting I do, or how successful my practice has become. They assume I do small-scale work, maybe helping local businesses with employee handbooks or conflict resolution. Pleasant, forgettable, unremarkable. The reality is that I'm a senior consultant in organizational development, specializing in culture transformation and structural efficiency. I work with mid-sized companies, sometimes companies with hundreds of employees, to identify toxic patterns in their leadership structures and rebuild them from the ground up. I analyze power dynamics, trace how decisions actually get made versus how they're supposed to get made, and help executives understand why their organizations are failing even when everyone seems to be doing their jobs. It's work that requires sharp strategic thinking, deep psychological insight, and the ability to see patterns others miss. I'm good at it. Very good. My client retention rate is over 90%, and I charge fees that would make Victoria's eyes water if she knew. My income has exceeded hers for the past 3 years, but I've never corrected their assumption that I make a comfortable but modest living. At family events, I wear clothes from department stores instead of boutiques. James and I drive practical cars, live in a nice but unshowy neighborhood, and never talk about vacations or purchases. Every choice has been deliberate. Stay under the radar. Don't trigger their competitive instincts. Don't give them reason to pay attention. I learned young that visibility invited attack. If I succeeded visibly, it would be dismissed or attributed to luck. If I failed visibly, it would confirm their beliefs about my limitations. But if I stayed invisible, if I let them believe I'd chosen a small, simple life, they would leave me alone. Invisibility became my armor, and I wore it so effectively that I almost forgot I was wearing it at all. "James," I said slowly, "when you made that phone call at the party, who did you call?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I saw him weighing something carefully. Finally he said, "I think it's time I told you something I should have told you years ago." What he revealed changed everything I thought I understood about my marriage and my family. 13 years ago, before we were married, James was a financial analyst at a mid-sized advisory firm. One of their clients was considering a partnership with my family's company, and James was assigned to do due diligence reviewing their financials, growth trajectory, and business model to assess viability. He was thorough, as he always is, going back through historical records to understand how the company had evolved. That's when he noticed something odd. The company had been struggling badly in 2004 and early 2005, nearly bankrupt according to the numbers. Then suddenly there was a dramatic turnaround in late 2005, based on a new business model: sustainable fashion, ethical supply chains, the whole concept that became Victoria's claim to fame. But when James reviewed the documentation, he found inconsistencies in the attribution. Early internal documents referenced the M. James proposal and mentioned a family member's innovative concept. Later documents had been revised to credit Victoria exclusively. He did something he probably shouldn't have. He tracked down the company's former CFO, a woman named Linda Morrison who'd retired in 2011. He contacted her under the pretense of verifying historical information for the due diligence report. Linda had been careful professional, but she'd hinted at irregularities. "The proposal's origins are complicated," she'd told him. "I'd recommend your client look very carefully at intellectual property attribution if they're considering partnership." James never completed that due diligence report the way his firm expected. He told his boss the company seemed viable, but he had concerns about ownership clarity that would need legal review, and the potential client decided to pursue other opportunities. James had kept copies of everything he'd found, the old documents, his notes, Linda Morrison's contact information. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached across the table and took my hand. "Because you weren't ready to hear it. Megan, when we met, you were so convinced that you were the problem that you deserved how they treated you. If I'd told you then what I suspected, you would have found a way to excuse it, to make it your fault somehow. I watched you for years, waiting for the day you'd be strong enough, angry enough, ready enough to actually do something about it. I've been preparing for this moment since before we got married." The revelation was staggering. My husband had known for 13 years that my family had stolen from me, and he'd said nothing. Part of me wanted to be angry about that, but I understood his reasoning. 5 years ago, if he'd told me, I would have talked myself out of believing it. I would have made excuses, convinced myself I was being dramatic, found reasons why it didn't really matter. He'd been waiting for me to be ready to fight, and that phone call he made at the party was him recognizing that the moment had finally arrived. That night, after James went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk and started writing down memories I'd dismissed or explained away over the years. The way my parents had asked so many detailed questions about my business proposal when I was 17, taking notes asking me to email them copies. The sudden career counseling session where they'd strongly encouraged me to consider psychology or education instead of business school, saying I'd be so good at helping people instead of getting involved in the competitive corporate world. The time at a family dinner when someone asked Victoria about the origins of the sustainable fashion line, and she'd gotten defensive, saying it was proprietary information and changing the subject so abruptly it had felt almost aggressive. The time my mother accidentally referred to Megan's original concept at a holiday gathering and then quickly corrected herself, saying she meant Victoria's concept, she'd just gotten confused. The way conversations would sometimes stop mid-sentence when I entered a room replaced by bright, forced smiles. None of these moments had seemed significant alone, but together they formed a pattern I'd been trained not to see. The truth wasn't loud or obvious. It was carefully buried under 20 years of family dinners, polite smiles, and collective amnesia. But Megan was finally ready to start digging. Over the next few days, I did something I'd never done before. I really looked at my sister. Not with the hurt of a lifetime of dismissal, not through the lens of my own pain, but with the analytical eye I used in my consulting work. I treated Victoria like a case study, an organizational problem to understand before attempting to solve. What I saw surprised me in ways I wasn't prepared for. Victoria's social media was a performance of perfection. Every post was carefully curated: her beautiful home, her accomplished children, her charity work, her business success. But I noticed something I'd missed before she posted constantly. Multiple times a day, documenting every achievement, every event, every moment that could be photographed and validated. Her captions were always some variation of gratitude and humility. So blessed. Grateful for this opportunity. Honored to be part of this. But the subtext was always the same: look at me, acknowledge me, tell me I matter. I found myself scrolling back through years of posts, and a pattern emerged that was almost painful in its desperation. Any post that didn't get enough likes or comments within the first hour would be deleted and reposted with different wording, different hashtags, a more flattering photo. She responded to every single comment, sometimes within minutes, as if she was monitoring her phone constantly for the validation she needed. When someone praised her, she'd screenshot it and share it to her stories with more humble gratitude. This wasn't confidence. This was a woman who needed constant external proof of her worth because she had none internally. I remembered something from our childhood that I hadn't thought about in decades. Victoria was 10, and she'd spent weeks preparing for a piano recital. She practiced obsessively to the point where my mother worried she wasn't sleeping enough. The recital itself was flawless. I remembered sitting in the audience impressed by how perfectly she played. But afterward, when the teacher gave her a certificate of achievement that went to all the students, Victoria had a complete breakdown in the car on the way home. She sobbed uncontrollably, saying it didn't count if everyone got the same certificate, that she needed a special one because she'd been the best. My parents hadn't comforted her or told her that her worth wasn't dependent on being better than everyone else. Instead, my father had gone back inside and asked the teacher to create a special award for Victoria's exceptional performance. That memory made me see my childhood differently. While I was being ignored, Victoria was being crushed under the weight of impossible expectations. Every parent-teacher conference was scrutinized for any hint that she wasn't excelling enough. Every B grade was met with concerned discussions about whether she was applying herself. Every social interaction was analyzed. Was she showing leadership, making the right friends, building the network she'd need? My parents' love for Victoria wasn't actually greater than their love for me. It was just more conditional, more demanding, more suffocating. "You're so talented, don't waste it," my mother used to tell her constantly. Not, "We're proud of you," or "We love you," but a reminder that talent created obligation. "We're counting on you," my father would say, placing the weight of their entire family's status on a child's shoulders. And the worst one, the one I remembered hearing multiple times, "Don't disappoint us the way your sister does." As if my very existence was a disappointment that Victoria must prevent herself from replicating. Victoria had learned that love was something you earned through achievement, and if you stopped achieving, you stopped being loved. The favoritism that destroyed my self-worth had also destroyed hers, just differently. She became addicted to external validation because she'd never been given the internal kind. She needed to be special to be the best, to be celebrated, because ordinary meant invisible, and invisible meant unloved. When the family company was failing in 2005 and I showed them my proposal, Victoria must have seen it as an existential threat. Here was her mediocre little sister creating something brilliant, something that could save the company, something that would shift the family narrative about who was talented and who wasn't. In that moment, she probably felt like she was drowning, and my proposal was the only lifeline available. Taking credit for it wasn't just opportunism, it was survival in a family system that had taught her that second place meant annihilation. This realization didn't make me forgive her. It didn't excuse what she'd done to me, or what she'd said to my children. But it helped me understand why the entire family protected her so fiercely. Victoria wasn't just my parents' daughter, she was their proof of concept. She was evidence that they were good parents, that their sacrifices had meaning, that their family deserved respect. If Victoria's success was revealed as partially fraudulent, built on stolen work, it would invalidate everything they believed about themselves. I thought about family gatherings over the years, how everyone participated in maintaining the mythology. Aunts and uncles would ask Victoria about the company with admiring tones and ask me about my children in that way that implied motherhood was my only real accomplishment. Cousins would reference Victoria's business genius as family pride, as if her success elevated all of us. Family friends who'd known us since childhood would tell stories about how they always knew Victoria would do great things, while looking past me as if I was barely there. This wasn't accidental. This was a collective agreement to uphold a narrative that made everyone feel good about themselves. Questioning Victoria's success meant questioning the family's judgment, their values, their story. So, no one did. And anyone who might have questioned it, like me, had been systematically trained to doubt their own perceptions, to accept the official story, to stay quiet. I realized that attacking Victoria directly would trigger the entire family defense system. They would circle their wagons, protect their narrative, and paint me as bitter, jealous, mentally unstable. They'd done it subtly for years, and they'd do it overtly if threatened. But if I could create conditions where Victoria's perfectionism worked against her, where her need for control and validation caused her to make mistakes, where the facade cracked from internal pressure rather than external attack, that was different. That was possible. Megan understood now her sister wasn't invincible, just extremely well protected, and the only way to break through those defenses was to let Victoria defeat herself with the very perfectionism that had always been her weapon. James helped me find the right attorney, someone who specialized in estate planning, and trusts someone who had no connection to my family or their business. Her name was Patricia Chen, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that I appreciated. When I explained what I wanted to do, she asked me why. Not in a judgmental way, but with the practical curiosity of someone who needed to understand motivations to provide the best advice. I want to simplify things. I told her, which was true, just not the complete truth. I'm financially independent, and I'd rather not be part of complicated family financial arrangements anymore. I want clean boundaries. She studied me for a moment, and I had the sense she understood more than I was saying. Estate planning can be complicated when family dynamics are involved, she said carefully. Let's make sure we do this correctly so there are no unintended consequences. The irony of that statement would have made me smile if the situation weren't so serious. The trust had been established in 2003 when Victoria was 30 and I was 24. My parents had created it as part of their estate planning, structuring it so that both daughters were beneficiaries with provisions for their grandchildren as well. At the time, I'd barely paid attention to the details. I was newly married, focused on building my career, and trusts seemed like something for much older people to worry about. I signed the papers my parents' attorney put in front of me and forgot about it. Now, 22 years later, I was formally renouncing my beneficiary status. Patricia drafted the documentation, making it clear and legal and completely above board. My stated reason was exactly what I'd told her: simplification, financial independence, desire for clean boundaries. Nothing adversarial, nothing that suggested conflict. Just a daughter making a reasonable choice about her financial future. 2 weeks after the birthday party, the paperwork was filed. Patricia called to confirm everything was in order and mentioned almost as an afterthought, "The trust will need to provide updated documentation to the IRS since you're withdrawing. Standard procedure when beneficiaries change. They'll need to pull historical records to show there's no tax avoidance happening." She said it like it was boring administrative detail, nothing important. I thanked her and hung up, and then I sat very still, letting myself feel the weight of what I'd just set in motion. My mother called 3 days later. "Megan, honey, we received papers about you withdrawing from the trust. Are you sure about this? You don't need to do that. Your family." Her tone was worried, but also slightly relieved, as if I'd removed a small burden she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. I kept my voice calm and pleasant. "I'm sure, Mom. James and I are doing fine financially, and I'd rather not complicate your estate planning. This makes things simpler for everyone." There was a pause, and then she said, "Well, if you're certain, your father and I just want you to be happy." We chatted for a few more minutes about the children, about nothing important, and when we hung up, I knew she'd already moved on, already filed this under Megan making things easier for everyone like she always does. Victoria didn't call at all, which told me everything I needed to know about her reaction. At a family dinner 3 weeks later, a casual Sunday lunch at my parents' house, she was almost cheerful around me, more relaxed than she'd been in months. She didn't mention the trust withdrawal directly, but her entire demeanor suggested relief. One less complication, one less person to consider, more validation that Megan knew her place in the family hierarchy. I played my part perfectly. I was pleasant, quiet, unremarkable. I complimented Victoria on her new bracelet and asked about Emma's writing lessons. I helped my mother clear dishes and listened to my father talk about his golf game. No one suspected that anything had changed because I'd spent 37 years training them to see exactly what I wanted them to see, a compliant, simple woman who didn't cause problems. What none of them knew was that the trust's legal team had received notification that comprehensive documentation was required for IRS compliance. Asset sources going back to the trust's 2003 establishment, intellectual property transfers, any business holdings that had been contributed to the trust structure. It was standard procedure, nothing alarming, just bureaucratic thoroughness. The trust's attorney had forwarded the requirement to Victoria since she was co-trustee and the company records were involved. Victoria, I learned later from my mother's casual mention, had delegated the task to her current CFO and legal team. "She's so busy with that new expansion project," my mother said proudly, "always juggling so many responsibilities." Victoria wasn't supervising the record gathering closely because she genuinely believed there was nothing to find. She thought any potentially problematic documentation from 2005 had been revised, updated, made clean. Just normal business practice, she'd probably told herself over the years. Nothing nefarious, nothing that could hurt her. She didn't know about Linda Morrison's copies. She didn't know that the original documents, the ones with my name and my handwriting, still existed. She didn't know that her current CFO, following standard protocol, would be reaching out to former employees to help locate archived materials. The hardest part was waiting. Every day I had to resist the urge to check on progress, to push things forward, to force outcomes. James watched me with careful concern, occasionally reminding me that once this path was fully traveled, there would be no returning to the way things were. "Are you sure?" he asked one night after the children were asleep. "Really sure, because once the truth comes out, the family you've known your whole life will never be the same." I thought about Lily's hunched shoulders and Marcus's silence, about my children learning to apologize for existing, about 37 years of being told I was less. "I'm not going back," I told him quietly. "Forward is the only direction left." And I meant it. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about refusing to teach my children that accepting mistreatment was the price of belonging. I used the waiting time strategically. I documented every family interaction, especially those involving the children, keeping careful notes with dates and details. I consulted with a family therapist, not for myself, but to understand the psychological dynamics I was dealing with, to prepare for what might come. I made sure Lily and Marcus had support, gentle conversations about self-worth, reassurance that they were valuable regardless of what anyone else said or did. The wheels were turning slowly and visibly, and only I knew they were turning at all. The game had begun, every piece moving into position with the slow inevitability of gravity, but only one player knew the board had been set, and she was willing to wait as long as it took for the first domino to fall. 5 weeks after I filed the trust withdrawal, I started noticing changes in Victoria that no one else seemed to see. It was nothing dramatic, nothing she would have acknowledged even to herself. But I'd spent a lifetime studying her moods and reading her signals. I could see the cracks forming even when she thought her facade was perfect. At first it was small things. She posted less frequently on social media, and when she did post, the captions were shorter, less effusive. A photo of a business luncheon came with just, "Great meeting today," instead of her usual paragraph about gratitude and opportunity. When someone commented asking for details, she didn't respond immediately, and when she finally did, hours later, her reply felt perfunctory. For Victoria, who treated social media engagement like a full-time job, this was significant. My mother mentioned casually during a phone call that Victoria was dealing with some stress at work. "Nothing serious," she assured me, "just the usual complications of running a company. A partnership negotiation isn't going as smoothly as expected, and you know how perfectionist your sister is." I made sympathetic noises and asked if Victoria needed anything, playing my role perfectly. My mother seemed surprised by the offer, but said no. Victoria had everything under control, she always did. But Victoria didn't have everything under control, and I could see it unraveling in slow motion. A business contact of mine, someone who occasionally crossed paths with Victoria's professional circles, mentioned that she'd seemed unusually tense at a recent networking event. Not her usual confident self, he said conversationally. Maybe she's dealing with board pressure or something. I filed the information away, saying nothing. The family Sunday dinner 6 weeks after the trust withdrawal was particularly revealing. My parents hosted at their house the way they did twice a month, and Victoria arrived 15 minutes late, which was unlike her. She apologized with a strained smile, blaming traffic, but I noticed she'd checked her phone twice before even removing her coat. Throughout dinner, she was distracted, responding to conversations a beat too slowly, her laughter forced and brittle. "The CFO is just not managing things efficiently," she complained when my father asked how work was going. "I've had to get involved in details I shouldn't need to touch. Historical record compilation of all things. Apparently we need to pull ancient documentation for some trust compliance issue." She waved her hand dismissively, as if the task was beneath her attention. "I've delegated it, obviously, but it's taking longer than it should. People just don't have the work ethic they used to." My parents murmured sympathetically. My mother patted Victoria's hand and said, "Everyone goes through demanding periods at work." My father suggested she consider hiring additional administrative support. No one asked me about my work, about my life, about anything. I sat at the end of the table helping Marcus cut his chicken and observed them with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a familiar tribe. Victoria checked her phone 3 more times during dinner. Her daughter asked her a question about an upcoming school event, and Victoria snapped at her to wait until she finished reading an email. Then, realizing what she'd done, she overcompensated with excessive enthusiasm about the event, her voice too bright, her smile too wide. My parents exchanged a glance that I caught worry mixed with confusion. Their golden daughter was showing stress fractures and they didn't know why. I maintained my usual demeanor, pleasant, quiet, helpful. I refilled water glasses and asked my mother if she needed help with dessert. I complimented Victoria on her new handbag and mentioned that Lily had loved a book Victoria's daughter had recommended. I gave them absolutely nothing to suspect, no reason to look at me as anything other than what I'd always been. That night, after the children were asleep, James found me in our home office reviewing documents. He'd been unusually quiet during dinner, watching Victoria with an expression I couldn't quite read. Now he closed the door behind him and sat down across from my desk with the serious demeanor that meant he had something important to say. "She's starting to feel it," he said without preamble. "The pressure, the unease. She doesn't know what's causing it yet, but she knows something is wrong." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Megan, I need you to understand something. When Victoria feels cornered, and she will soon, she's not going to fight fair. She won't come at you with facts or business disputes. She'll go after your character." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "I've been watching her social media, her professional presence, the way she operates. Her greatest skill isn't actually business, it's narrative control. She makes people believe her version of reality. And when she feels threatened, she'll use that skill to destroy credibility before anyone even questions her." He paused, making sure I understood. "She'll tell people you're unstable, that you've always been jealous, that you're having mental health issues, marriage problems, parenting struggles. She'll weaponize concern, make it look like she's worried about you while painting you as unreliable." I felt a chill run through me, not because I was surprised, but because I knew he was right. I'd seen Victoria do this before, to business rivals, to former friends who'd somehow threatened her. She never attacked openly. She expressed concern, asked leading questions, planted seeds of doubt. "I'm just worried about Sarah," she'd say about a colleague who'd challenged her, and then mention offhand that Sarah had seemed emotional, lately unstable, making poor decisions. By the time Sarah tried to defend herself, everyone already believed Victoria's narrative that Sarah was the problem. "What do I do?" I asked. James pulled out a folder from the bag he'd been carrying. "We document everything. Every interaction, every conversation, every witness to your competence and stability. We make sure that when she starts her campaign, and she will, there's a paper trail that contradicts every accusation. We stay ahead of the narrative." We spent the next hour going through his strategy. He'd already started collecting evidence of my professional success references from clients' records of my children's school performance and well-being. He'd thought of things I hadn't considered, character references from neighbors' documentation of our stable marriage, even therapy notes showing I was mentally healthy and dealing with family stress in productive ways. "You're preparing for war," I said quietly. He met my eyes. "No. I'm preparing for the kind of fight Victoria knows how to win. The kind where truth doesn't matter as much as who tells the story first." The real danger wasn't in financial records or legal documents. It was in Victoria's uncanny ability to weaponize love and family loyalty, and Megan knew the first strike could come at any moment disguised as concern. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was between client meetings sitting in my car in a parking garage. The number was unfamiliar, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Megan James?" A woman's voice asked, thin and strained, as if speaking required significant effort. When I confirmed, she said, "My name is Linda Morrison. I was the CFO of your family's company from 2003 to 2011. I need to talk to you about something I should have told you 20 years ago." My heart started pounding before my mind fully processed why. Linda continued without waiting for my response, as if she'd rehearsed this and needed to get through it before losing her nerve. "I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. They've given me maybe 6 months. I've been carrying something for 2 decades and I can't die with this weight." She paused and I heard her take a shaky breath. "I was there when your family stole your business proposal. I signed the documents that made it legal fraud. I kept copies of everything because I was afraid they'd try to blame me if it ever came out. And now I'm dying, and I need you to know what really happened." I sat in that parking garage for over an hour while Linda Morrison told me everything. Her voice was weak, fading in and out, but her memory was sharp and detailed. She remembered the day in late 2005 when my father had called an emergency meeting with her and the company's attorney. The business was failing. Bankruptcy was imminent, and they'd just received my proposal forwarded to them by my mother with a note saying, "Megan's school project, but the ideas might be worth reviewing." Linda described how my father had recognized immediately that my sustainable fashion concept could save the company, but he'd also recognized a problem. I was 17, a minor with no business experience. Investors wouldn't take a high school girl seriously no matter how brilliant her ideas were. They needed someone credible to front the proposal, someone with a business degree and professional presence. Victoria had just graduated from business school and joined the company. She was young but polished, articulate, exactly the kind of face that could sell an innovative vision. They asked me what the legal implications would be if Victoria presented the proposal as her own work. Linda said, her voice carrying shame that 20 years hadn't diminished. I told them it was ethically questionable but legally possible if the intellectual property was transferred correctly. Your father said they'd tell you about it later, that you'd understand that they were protecting you from pressure you weren't ready for. She paused. I knew it was wrong. I knew they were exploiting you. But I was 43 years old, and it was my first CFO position, and I was terrified of losing everything if I objected. So I processed the paperwork crediting Victoria as the proposal's author, and I kept my mouth shut. As she spoke, my email pinged repeatedly. Linda was sending me scanned documents, hundreds of pages that she'd kept hidden for 2 decades. I pulled them up on my phone with shaking hands, and what I saw made me feel physically sick. Investor agreements explicitly listing Victoria as the original creator and visionary behind the Sustainable Fashion Initiative. Board meeting minutes from 2006 praising Victoria's innovative thinking and entrepreneurial brilliance. Compensation structures justifying Victoria's salary increases, and equity grants based on her groundbreaking contribution that saved the company. A press release celebrating Victoria as a young business leader whose vision had transformed a failing company into an industry innovator. Every single document was a lie, and every lie was documented, official, distributed to people who made decisions based on false information. This wasn't subtle favoritism or family dynamics. This was systematic fraud carefully executed and maintained for 20 years. The internal emails were even worse. My parents discussing how to handle the attribution issue without creating unnecessary complications. My father writing, "Megan is too young to understand the business implications. This protects her from pressure she can't handle." My mother responding, "Victoria can carry this responsibility. She's ready for it, and Megan will be fine. She'll build her own life." The company attorney advising, "If this is how the family wants to proceed, we can structure it legally, but understand this must remain the official story going forward." They had planned it, discussed it, made deliberate choices to erase my contribution and credit Victoria. And they'd convinced themselves it was protective, that they were doing me a favor by shielding me from business pressures that I was better off not knowing. Linda's voice pulled me back. "The statute of limitations on intellectual property theft has expired," she said, and I could hear she'd researched this carefully. "But fraud is different. The clock starts when you discover the fraud, not when it happened. You could pursue this legally if you wanted to. You'd have grounds for misrepresentation, unjust enrichment, maybe more. I'm willing to testify if it comes to that. I'm dying anyway, they can't hurt me anymore." I drove home in a daze, pulled into our garage, and sat there for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. James found me still sitting in the car and knew immediately that something catastrophic had happened. I showed him the documents on my phone, watched his face change as he read, and then I said the thing that had been echoing in my mind since Linda's call: "I can destroy them. All of them. My parents, Victoria, the entire company. I have the evidence, I have the witness, and I have the legal standing. I could do it." James sat beside me in the passenger seat and said quietly, "You could. The question is whether you should." He was right. This wasn't simple anymore. My parents were in their late 60s, their retirement funded by a company built partially on my stolen work. Victoria's entire identity, her marriage, her children's stability, all of it rested on a reputation that would be obliterated if this came out. The company employed over 50 people who had nothing to do with the fraud, but would suffer if scandal collapsed the business. Extended family members innocent of everything, except believing the official story would be caught in the explosion. And me. If I pursued this, I wouldn't be the wronged party seeking justice. I'd be the daughter who destroyed her family, the sister who ruined lives, the person who chose vengeance over mercy. Victoria would make sure everyone saw me that way, and they'd believe her because they always had. The truth would free her from 37 years of being diminished, dismissed, and erased, but it would also detonate every relationship and legacy her family had built, and Megan had to decide if justice was worth becoming the person who destroyed everything, even if she had the right. I spent 3 days wrestling with the decision about what to do with Linda's evidence before Victoria made the choice more complicated. Linda called me again, her voice even weaker than before, to tell me something that changed the dynamics entirely. "Your sister contacted me," she said without preamble. "She called yesterday very friendly, asking how I was doing in retirement. It was obvious what she was really doing, trying to figure out what I know and whether I'm a threat." Linda described the conversation with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent decades in corporate environments reading subtext. Victoria had started with pleasantries, mentioning that the company was doing well, asking about Linda's health with apparent concern. Then she'd shifted to the real purpose the trust audit had required, pulling old records, and some documentation from 2004 to 2006 was proving difficult to locate. "You know how it is with archived materials," Victoria had said with a light laugh. "Things get misfiled, records get confusing over time. I was hoping you might remember where certain documents were stored, or if there were any irregularities in the filing system back then." The phrasing was careful, designed to plant the idea that any discrepancies were administrative errors rather than deliberate fraud. Linda had responded coolly, telling Victoria that she'd kept meticulous records during her tenure and nothing had been confusing or misfiled. There was a long silence, Linda said, and then Victoria's tone had shifted slightly, becoming more direct. "Of course you did. You were always so thorough. In fact, if you still have any personal records or notes from that period, the company would be happy to compensate you as a consultant to help us sort through the historical documentation, just to make sure everything is interpreted correctly. It was a bribe thinly veiled as a consulting fee. Victoria was offering money for Linda's silence and cooperation, but Linda was dying, and money meant nothing to someone with 6 months to live. I told her I didn't need a consulting fee, Linda said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her weak voice. And then I told her I'd already spoken with you, that I'd given you copies of everything, that I thought you deserved to know what really happened with your proposal. I felt my stomach drop. How did she react? Linda's laugh was bitter. She tried to hide it, but I heard the panic. She asked what specifically I'd told you, whether I'd sent you documents, what you planned to do with the information. I told her that was between you and me. Then she got quiet for a long time, and when she spoke again, all the friendliness was gone. She said I was making a mistake, that I didn't understand the full context, that dredging up old business decisions would hurt innocent people. Then she hung up. So Victoria knew. She knew I had the evidence, knew Linda had betrayed the family secret, and knew that her entire life was potentially at risk. I should have predicted what would happen next, but I underestimated how quickly she would move and how effectively she would weaponize the one thing I couldn't easily defend against family concern. My mother called 2 days later, her voice carrying that particular tone of worried care that immediately put me on alert. "Sweetheart, your sister called me yesterday. She's very worried about you." I kept my voice neutral, asking what Victoria was worried about. My mother sighed. "She said you've been withdrawing from the family, that you seemed distant at the last Sunday dinner, that pulling out of the trust was concerning. And apparently you've been contacting old company employees, asking questions about ancient business records. Megan, honey, is everything okay? Are you and James having problems? Is there something going on that we should know about?" The narrative was already being constructed, and it was masterful in its simplicity. Victoria had positioned herself as the concerned sister who'd noticed troubling changes in my behavior. The trust withdrawal, which I'd framed as financial independence, was now being reinterpreted as withdrawal and instability. My contact with Linda, which Victoria didn't mention directly, but implied through contacting old employees, was being painted as obsessive and odd. The foundation was being laid for a story where I was the problem, emotionally unstable, possibly paranoid, definitely troubled. "I'm fine, Mom," I said carefully. "Work has been busy, and the kids have a lot going on. I'm not sure what Victoria is concerned about." My mother hesitated, and I knew she was deciding how much to say. "She thinks maybe we should all get together, just family, to talk. She's worried you might be depressed or overwhelmed. She suggested maybe we could do a family check-in just to make sure you have the support you need." A family intervention. Victoria was setting up a family intervention to address my supposed mental health and emotional struggles. It was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. If I refused, I'd look defensive and paranoid, confirming her narrative that something was wrong with me. If I attended, I'd walk into a situation where Victoria controlled the framing, where any attempt to explain the real situation would sound like the ramblings of an unstable person looking for someone to blame for her problems. I told my mother I'd think about it, that I appreciated the concern, but wasn't sure a family meeting was necessary. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, understanding fully for the first time that Victoria wasn't just protecting her reputation, she was preemptively destroying mine. By the time I tried to reveal the truth about the stolen proposal, the family would already believe I was emotionally compromised, jealous, possibly delusional. Anything I said would be filtered through the story Victoria was carefully constructing. Poor Megan, always in her sister's shadow, finally cracking under the weight of her own inadequacy and inventing elaborate conspiracy theories to explain her failures. James found me that evening researching family interventions and psychological manipulation tactics. "She's already started," I told him, showing him my notes. "She's painting me as unstable before I can establish credibility. By the time this plays out, no one will believe anything I say because they'll think I'm having a breakdown." He read through my notes, his expression growing darker. "She's good at this. She's been doing it her whole life, controlling narratives, making people believe her version of reality. He looked at me seriously. If you go to this family intervention, you need to be prepared. You can't defend yourself too vigorously or you'll confirm her story. You can't refuse to go or you'll look like you're avoiding family. You have to walk a very fine line between engaged and defensive. I realized then that Victoria had turned this into a chess game where she'd already moved several pieces into position before I'd even understood we were playing. She'd identified Linda as the threat attempted to contain. It failed and immediately pivoted to attacking my credibility instead. She didn't need to disprove the evidence of fraud if she could convince everyone that I was too unstable to be believed in the first place. Victoria had built an empire on appearances and maintained it through strategic charm and calculated concern, and now she would use those exact weapons to destroy her sister's credibility before Megan could threaten her world. Except this time she was fighting an opponent she'd consistently underestimated for 37 years. I decided not to attend the family intervention Victoria had orchestrated. I told my mother politely but firmly that I didn't think it was necessary, that I was managing just fine, and that gathering the family to discuss my supposed struggles would be uncomfortable for everyone, especially my children. My mother sounded disappointed but didn't push, which told me she wasn't fully convinced by Victoria's narrative yet. But I knew Victoria wouldn't stop with one attempt. She'd find other ways to establish her version of reality, and I needed to be ready. The charity gala invitation arrived 2 weeks later. The annual Children's Literacy Foundation Gala, an event Victoria had been involved with for years, always attended, always photographed. This year she was on the planning committee, her name prominently listed on the invitation. The event was 3 months after the birthday party, and I understood immediately what Victoria was doing. This was her territory, her crowd, her opportunity to control the narrative in a public setting where I typically didn't appear. James looked at the invitation and then at me with raised eyebrows. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" I was. Victoria expected me to stay away, to remain invisible like I always had. She was counting on my absence to confirm her story about my withdrawal and instability. But what if I didn't give her that satisfaction? "I'm going," I said. James smiled slightly. "Then we're buying you a new dress. If you're going to walk into the lion's den, you're going to look absolutely perfect doing it." We spent a weekend shopping, something we rarely did, and found a dress that was elegant without being flashy, sophisticated without trying too hard. I wanted to look like exactly what I was: a successful, stable, confident woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. The gala was held at an upscale hotel downtown, the ballroom decorated with understated elegance. I arrived with James fashionably on time and watched Victoria's face when she saw me walk in. For just a moment, her practiced smile faltered. She hadn't expected this. She recovered quickly, but I'd seen the flash of panic, and it told me everything I needed to know about how threatened she felt. I spent the cocktail hour doing something I normally avoided at family-adjacent events I networked. I introduced myself to people, made genuine conversation about the literacy cause, asked questions, and listened to answers. I was warm without being overwhelming, present without demanding attention. Several people mentioned they'd heard I was Victoria's sister, and they seemed genuinely interested in meeting me. "Victoria speaks of you sometimes," one woman said, though her tone suggested the speaking hadn't been particularly complimentary. Then came Victoria's speech. She stood at the podium looking radiant and composed, thanking the attendees for their support, talking about the importance of children's literacy, sharing heartwarming statistics about the foundation's impact. She was practiced at this, comfortable in the spotlight, and for most of the speech she was genuinely impressive. But then near the end, she shifted her focus. "Family is so important," she said, her voice warm with emotion. "Supporting each other through difficult times, being there when someone is struggling. My own sister Megan is here tonight, and I just want to acknowledge her publicly." She gestured in my direction, and suddenly dozens of eyes were on me. "She's been going through a challenging time lately, dealing with some personal issues, and I want her to know that her family loves her, and we're all supporting her from whatever distance she needs while she navigates this difficult period." It was masterfully done. The words were loving and supportive, but the implication was devastating. Personal issues, challenging time, distance she needs. To anyone listening, it sounded like I was having a breakdown, marital problems, something serious enough to require space and concern. Victoria smiled at me warmly, encouragingly, and a photographer captured the moment, the caring sister publicly supporting her troubled sibling. I smiled back and raised my glass slightly in acknowledgement, my expression calm and gracious. Then I went back to my conversation as if nothing significant had happened, because in my world, nothing had. After the speech, people approached me with that particular combination of curiosity and sympathy that Victoria had been counting on. "I hope you're doing all right," one woman said carefully. "Victoria mentioned you're going through something difficult." I gave her my full attention and responded with carefully chosen honesty. "I'm doing wonderfully, thank you for asking. I've been focusing more on my children and my consulting work lately, which means I'm more selective about which social and family events I attend. But I wouldn't miss supporting such an important cause. Children's literacy is something I care deeply about." The woman looked slightly confused, as if my composed demeanor didn't match the troubled person she'd been primed to expect. Throughout the evening, I stayed engaged, warm, present. I didn't hide in corners or leave early. I didn't appear fragile or withdrawn. I was simply myself, competent, articulate, stable, and the disconnect between Victoria's description and my actual presence created cognitive dissonance for everyone who interacted with me. Several people told me they enjoyed meeting me and hoped to see me at future events. One man even said, "You should come to these things more often. Victoria always makes it sound like you're not really involved in the community, but you're clearly intelligent and engaged." I watched Victoria throughout the night, and what I saw was revealing. She was in the spotlight, being photographed and praised, collecting the external validation she craved. But she couldn't enjoy it. Her eyes kept finding me across the room, tracking my conversations, monitoring my interactions. Every time she saw someone laughing with me or engaging warmly, her smile tightened. She'd created a narrative that required my absence or obvious instability to work, and I'd undermined it simply by showing up as my actual self. The contrast between us had never been more visible. Victoria needed the spotlight, needed the constant affirmation, needed everyone to see her and validate her worth. I'd learned to exist without any of that, and paradoxically, that independence made me more powerful than her desperate need for attention. The louder Victoria's spotlight burned, the more obvious her desperation became, while Megan's quiet presence in the shadows suggested a woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist, and that shift in power was far more threatening than any public accusation. In the weeks following the charity gala, I did something that required more self-control than anything I'd done before. I did nothing. I maintained my normal routine, went to work, took care of my children, attended one Sunday dinner with my family where I was pleasant and unremarkable. I didn't contact Linda Morrison. I didn't follow up on the trust audit. I didn't make any moves at all. I simply waited and watched while Victoria destroyed herself with her own paranoia. James brought me updates he gathered through his professional network and careful observation of public information. The trust audit was progressing slowly, as these things always did, requesting documentation from various periods in the company's history. Victoria's current CFO, a man named David Park, who'd been with the company for 5 years, was handling the compliance work, coordinating with the legal team to gather archived records. It was standard, boring administrative work, the kind that any competent CFO would manage without drama. But Victoria wasn't seeing it that way. James learned through a mutual professional contact that Victoria had become increasingly micromanaging about the audit process, questioning David's methods, demanding to review every document before it was submitted, and generally behaving as if she expected to find problems. David, who by all accounts was thorough and professional, had apparently been confused by her sudden lack of trust in his competence. Then James heard something more interesting. David had recently pushed back on some expense allocations Victoria had approved, pointing out that certain charges didn't have adequate documentation and might create issues if the company were ever audited by the IRS. He'd been doing his job protecting the company from potential liability. But in Victoria's current state of heightened anxiety, that professional diligence looked like something more sinister. I learned what happened next from my mother's phone call, though she didn't understand the significance of what she was telling me. Victoria had to let her CFO go. My mother said, her tone sympathetic toward Victoria's burden of leadership. Apparently, there were strategic differences and reorganization needs. It's so stressful for her having to make these difficult personnel decisions. I made appropriate sympathetic sounds while my mind raced through the implications. Victoria had fired David Park. She'd eliminated what she perceived as an internal threat, someone who might be undermining her or feeding information to auditors. The paranoid logic was almost visible. David had questioned her expenses. David had access to historical records. David must be the problem. She couldn't conceive that her actual threat was her dismissed little sister who didn't even work in her industry. So she'd focused all her defensive energy on the wrong target entirely. James pulled up the LinkedIn activity later that evening. 3 senior employees from Victoria's company had updated their profiles to open to opportunities within days of David's termination. One had posted a carefully worded message about the importance of ethical leadership and standing behind good people, corporate speak for, "I'm disgusted by what just happened." The company's internal stability, which Victoria had been so proud of, was fracturing. Worse for Victoria, David had apparently consulted an employment attorney. James found the attorney's website and noted that they specialized in wrongful termination cases. David had been fired without clear cause, let go from a job he'd been performing competently, and he had every right to question whether the termination was legitimate. Victoria had created legal exposure where none had existed before. I attended a family dinner at Victoria's house 2 weeks after the firing, curious to see how she was handling the stress. What I observed was both satisfying and disturbing in its implications. Victoria was drinking wine faster than usual, refilling her glass before it was empty, her laughter too loud and too sharp. When her daughter asked her something during dinner, Victoria snapped at her to wait, then immediately overcompensated with excessive enthusiasm that made the child flinch. My father, always uncomfortable with conflict, tried to make small talk about the company. "How are things at work, sweetheart? We saw you had some personnel changes." Victoria's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. "Why are you asking about that? Don't you trust my judgment? I'm handling it. I don't need everyone questioning my decisions." The room went silent. My father looked stunned. My mother reached over to touch Victoria's hand, and Victoria pulled away, her eyes too bright, her breathing too fast. I watched my parents exchange a look that I recognized, worried confusion mixed with dawning awareness that something was seriously wrong with their golden daughter. But even then, even seeing Victoria unravel, they didn't turn to me. They didn't ask if I knew anything. They didn't consider that I might have any insight into Victoria's professional life or emotional state. Their blind spot was so complete that they literally couldn't see me as relevant to understanding what was happening. Later, as James and I drove home, I told him what I'd observed. "She's making it worse for herself," I said quietly. "Every defensive move she makes creates new problems. She fired someone loyal out of paranoia. She's alienating her staff. She's showing stress to the family in ways she's never done before. And she still doesn't realize I'm the actual threat she should be worried about." James was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's what makes this so effective. You're not attacking her. You're just watching her attack herself." The trust withdrawal set things in motion, but everything since then has been Victoria's own paranoia and poor judgment destroying what she built. He glanced at me. "The question is, when do you actually make your move? Because right now she's fighting shadows. But eventually she'll figure out where the real threat is." He was right. Victoria's misdirected counterattack was buying me time and credibility. Every mistake she made, every overreaction, every sign of instability would make my eventual revelation more believable. But it couldn't last forever. Eventually, Victoria would exhaust all the wrong suspects and finally look at the one person she'd trained herself never to see as dangerous. Victoria had fired the wrong person, suspected the wrong motives, and fortified her defenses against imaginary threats, while the real danger remained exactly where it had always been in the sister she'd trained herself never to see as capable of threatening anything she'd built. 4 months after the birthday party, I was in my office working on a client presentation when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Ms. James, this is Sarah Mitchell from the Business Ethics Journal. I'm working on a story about corporate governance and intellectual property attribution, and I'd like to ask you some questions about your family's company." My stomach dropped. Sarah Mitchell was a respected investigative journalist who specialized in corporate fraud and financial irregularities. I'd read her work before she was thorough, fair, and relentless. "I'm not involved with my family's company," I said carefully. "I'm not sure I can help you." "Actually, you're very relevant to this story," Sarah said, her tone professional but direct. "I've obtained preliminary findings from a trust audit that suggest significant discrepancies in intellectual property attribution dating back to 2005. Specifically, there are questions about whether a business proposal that saved the company was properly credited. Your name appears in some early documentation as a potential creator, but all public records credit your sister Victoria. I'd like to give you an opportunity to comment before I publish." The room seemed to tilt. Someone had leaked audit findings to a journalist. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. The audit wasn't complete. I hadn't decided what to do with Linda's evidence. I wasn't ready for this to become public. I need to think about this," I managed to say. Sarah's voice softened slightly. "I understand this is sensitive, but I want to be clear, I'm publishing this story regardless of whether you participate. I have documentation, I have sources, and the discrepancies are significant enough to warrant public scrutiny. I'm giving you 24 hours to decide if you want to provide your perspective. If not, I'll proceed with what I have." She gave me her direct number and email, then hung up. I sat staring at my phone, my mind racing through catastrophic scenarios. If Sarah published now based on incomplete information, it would be chaos. My parents would be blindsided. Victoria would have time to construct a defensive narrative. The story would be told without my voice, without context, without the careful strategy I'd been building. Everything would spiral out of my control. James came home early after I called him, hearing the panic in my voice. We sat at the kitchen table for hours talking through options. "You can't confirm anything," he said. "The moment you do, you lose control of the timeline completely. But you can't refuse comment either, because then Sarah publishes without your perspective, and Victoria gets to frame the narrative." "So, what do I do?" I asked, feeling helpless in a way I hadn't felt since the birthday party. James thought for a long moment, then said, "Let me call her. As your representative, not as you. I can buy us time without lying or confirming anything damaging." He drafted talking points, and I watched him rehearse the conversation, admiring his strategic thinking even through my panic. When he called Sarah Mitchell the next morning, I listened on speaker. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm James Chen, Megan James's husband. She's asked me to respond to your inquiry on her behalf." His voice was calm, measured, carrying authority without aggression. "We appreciate your diligence in investigating this matter. However, we want to be clear that publishing a story based on preliminary audit findings would be premature and potentially defamatory. The audit is ongoing, and conclusions drawn from incomplete documentation could expose both you and your publication to significant legal liability." Sarah started to respond, but James continued smoothly. "We're not asking you to kill the story. We're asking you to do it right. Wait for the complete audit findings. Allow all parties opportunity to respond appropriately. My wife is prepared to cooperate fully with your reporting when the time is right, but that time isn't now. Publishing prematurely serves no one except perhaps those who might want to obscure the truth by creating chaos." There was silence, then Sarah said, "How long are we talking?" James replied. "The audit should be complete in 6 to 8 weeks. At that point, you'll have comprehensive documentation, official findings, and will provide full cooperation with your reporting." Another pause. All right, Sarah finally said. 6 weeks. But if this gets scooped by another outlet because I waited, I'm publishing immediately with what I have. James thanked her and ended the call. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. You bought us time, I said. He nodded grimly. But we're not in control anymore. Too many people know pieces of this now. It's going to come out. The only question is when and how. That evening, my phone rang again. Victoria's name appeared on the screen and my hand trembled as I answered. We hadn't spoken directly since the birthday party. I know what you're doing, she said without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. A journalist called me asking about IP attribution from 2005. This is you, isn't it? You're trying to destroy me. Victoria, I started, but she cut me off. Let me be very clear about something, Megan. If you do anything to embarrass this family, to hurt Mom and Dad, to damage what we've built, I will make sure you never see your children at another family event. Ever. I will turn everyone against you. I will make you the villain in this story, and everyone will believe me because they always have. Her voice rose, becoming shrill. And if you think you can win this, remember who has the resources, the connections, the credibility? Who do you think people will believe? The successful businesswoman or the jealous sister who spent her whole life being mediocre? The line went dead. I sat there, my phone still pressed to my ear, and James found me minutes later, pale and shaking. She threatened my children, I whispered. She said she'd make sure they never see the family again if I don't back down. James took the phone from my trembling hand and pulled me close. And something that had been holding me back, some last vestige of sisterly feeling, some remaining guilt about causing pain, simply evaporated. Victoria had used my children as weapons. She'd made it clear that her desperation knew no moral boundaries. The carefully orchestrated strategy had nearly collapsed under the weight of forces beyond Megan's control. But Victoria's panicked threat had accomplished something Megan's moral complexity couldn't. It removed any remaining guilt Megan felt about what she was about to unleash. Victoria's phone call changed something fundamental in how I moved through the world. I stopped being careful about protecting everyone's feelings. I stopped worrying about whether my actions would hurt people who'd spent decades hurting me. The threat against my children had burned away the last of my hesitation, and apparently it showed. My brother Daniel texted me 3 days after Victoria's call, asking if we could meet for coffee. Just the two of us, no family, no agenda. Daniel was 33, 7 years younger than me, and had always been the family peacekeeper. He didn't compete with Victoria for attention or with me for validation. He'd simply tried to exist quietly in the margins of our family's drama, which made him more perceptive than anyone gave him credit for. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our houses, and I could see immediately that he was nervous. He ordered his coffee, sat down across from me, and said without preamble, "Something is really wrong, isn't it? Not just normal family tension. Something bigger." I studied him carefully, trying to decide how much to say. "What makes you think that?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "I've been watching Victoria at family dinners. She's not okay. She's drinking more, she's snapping at people, she's checking her phone obsessively like she's waiting for bad news. And Mom and Dad, they look terrified. Not worried terrified. Like they know something awful is coming and they can't stop it." He paused. "And then there's you. You've changed. You're not disappearing into the background anymore. You're present, but distant, like you're watching all of us from somewhere else entirely." I didn't confirm or deny anything, just waited to see what else he'd say. Daniel took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone. I don't know if it's relevant, but it's been eating at me for years, and with everything that's happening now, I think you need to know." He described a night in 2007 when he was 15 years old. He'd come downstairs late to get water and heard our parents arguing in the study. The door was slightly open and our father's voice was slurred. He'd been drinking, which he rarely did. "We made a terrible mistake," Daniel had heard him say. "I don't know how to fix it. It's been 2 years and it's gotten worse, not better. We should have told her from the beginning." Our mother had been crying. We can't tell her now. It would destroy Victoria. She's built her whole identity on this. If she finds out the truth, she'll never forgive us and the company. Her voice had broken. We have to protect Victoria. She can't handle this. Megan is stronger. She'll be fine. But what if she's not fine? Their father had asked. What if we've damaged her in ways we can't see? Daniel had heard movement and fled back upstairs, his heart pounding, not understanding what they'd been talking about, but knowing it was important and terrible. I didn't know what it meant, Daniel said, now his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. I was 15. I didn't have context. But I never forgot it, and over the years, watching how differently you and Victoria were treated, watching how Mom and Dad always protected her and dismissed you, I started to wonder if that conversation was about you, about something they did to you. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. They knew, I said quietly. Even back then, they knew what they'd done was wrong. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. Whatever it is, whatever they did, I'm on your side. I should have been on your side all along. I'm sorry I wasn't. The confession from my brother, this unexpected ally, gave me something I hadn't fully realized. I needed validation that I wasn't imagining things, that the family dynamics I'd experienced were as wrong as I'd always felt they were. But it also confirmed something painful. My parents had chosen to protect Victoria over making things right with me, and they'd made that choice consciously, repeatedly for 20 years. I learned later through my mother's sister, who let something slip during a phone call, that my parents were having their own crisis. My aunt mentioned in passing that my mother seemed very stressed lately, and had confided that she and my father were dealing with old decisions coming back to haunt them. My aunt didn't know specifics, but she said my mother had been crying a lot and my father had been drinking more than usual. I imagined them in their house, these people in their late 60s who'd built a comfortable life on a foundation of lies, finally confronting the fact that the truth was coming, whether they wanted it to or not. I imagined my mother saying to my father what Daniel had heard her say 18 years ago. We should have told Megan the truth when she turned 21 like we planned. We should have made it right when we still could. And my father responding with the defeated resignation of someone who knows they're trapped by their own cowardice. If we tell her now, Victoria will never forgive us. The company could be destroyed. We're trapped. They were trapped, but not by circumstances. They were trapped by choosing comfort over courage at every decision point for 2 decades. They could have told me the truth in 2006 or 2007 or any year after. They could have admitted what they'd done, apologized, tried to make amends. Instead, they'd hoped that time would erase the problem, that I would never find out that Victoria's success would retroactively justify their theft. What they hadn't counted on was that time doesn't erase injustice, it compounds it. Every year they stayed silent was another year of teaching me I didn't matter, another year of Victoria building her identity on stolen foundation, another year of lies becoming so integrated into the family story that the truth seemed impossible to speak. And now the truth was coming out anyway, messier and more destructive than it would have been if they'd just been honest 20 years ago. But even now, facing the inevitable collapse of their carefully maintained fiction, they still weren't willing to proactively confess. They were still hoping somehow they could avoid accountability, that the situation would resolve itself without requiring them to admit what they'd done. Doubt had entered the room where certainty once lived, and even the family members who had built their entire identity on supporting Victoria were beginning to question whether the foundation they'd all been standing on was solid ground or just a beautifully maintained illusion. Having Daniel's support, and knowing my parents were drowning in guilt, gave me strength I hadn't expected. But Victoria wasn't finished. 2 weeks after my coffee with Daniel, my mother called with what she presented as wonderful news. Victoria has arranged something really constructive, she said, her voice carrying forced brightness. She's found a family therapist who specializes in helping families work through communication issues. We're all going to have a session together, you, me, your father, Victoria, Daniel, and our spouses. Isn't that healthy? Victoria said. It's important that we address family tensions before they cause permanent damage. I felt ice settle in my stomach. "A family therapy session," I repeated flatly. My mother rushed to explain that Dr. Karen Whitman came highly recommended, that Victoria had found her through professional contacts, that the session would be neutral and safe, and focused on healing. Everything about how my mother described it told me this was Victoria's idea. Victoria's choice of therapist, Victoria's framework. I'd walked into enough corporate manipulation to recognize a setup. But I also knew refusing would confirm Victoria's narrative that I was the problem, the one unwilling to work on family relationships, the unstable sister who couldn't handle constructive dialogue. So I agreed, and James immediately began researching Dr. Whitman. What he found was illuminating. Her published articles emphasized family cohesion, preserving relationships, and the importance of forgiveness. She'd written about how individual grievances sometimes needed to be subordinated for family unity. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of therapist who would see me as the problem if Victoria framed the situation correctly. The session was scheduled at Dr. Whitman's office on a Saturday morning. When James and I arrived, the seating arrangement was the first red flag. Victoria had positioned herself next to Dr. Whitman, with our parents flanking her like protective bookends. Daniel sat uncertainly to the side, and there were 2 empty chairs across from them, clearly meant for James and me. The physical setup created an us versus them dynamic before anyone spoke. Dr. Whitman was in her 50s, professionally dressed, with the practiced warm smile of someone who'd mediated countless family conflicts. She started with standard therapeutic framing about creating safe space for honest communication. Then she said something that confirmed my suspicions. "Victoria reached out to me several weeks ago expressing concern about family dynamics, and I appreciate her initiative in bringing everyone together." Victoria had met with this therapist privately, shaped her understanding, set the narrative foundation before I ever walked in the room. "Megan," Dr. Whitman said gently, "Victoria has shared that you've been withdrawing from family recently, and she's concerned about you. Can you help us understand what's been happening from your perspective?" The question was designed to put me on the defensive, to make me explain myself, while Victoria's version was already established as the baseline. But before I could answer, Victoria began to speak. Her performance was masterful. She talked about how much she loved me, how worried she'd been watching me pull away from the family. Her voice caught with emotion as she described feeling rejected, confused about what she'd done to cause such distance. "I just want to understand," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "Megan, if I hurt you somehow, I want to make it right. But I can't fix what I don't understand." She talked about her concerns that I was teaching my children to hate the family, that my withdrawal was affecting not just me, but the next generation. She never said anything directly accusatory. It was all wrapped in loving concern and confusion about why I'd changed, in fear that some childhood resentment was poisoning current relationships. "I know we had typical sibling dynamics growing up," she said carefully. "Maybe I got more attention sometimes. But that was our parents' choice, not mine. I can't change the past. I just want us to move forward." My parents nodded along, their expressions pained but sympathetic toward Victoria. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Dr. Whitman made notes, her body language suggesting she was forming conclusions about family roles and dynamics. When Victoria finally finished, Dr. Whitman turned to me. "Megan, you've heard your sister express deep concern and love. Can you help us understand what's preventing you from engaging with the family the way you used to?" The question assumed the problem was my emotional state, my perceptions, my inability to let go of the past. I took a breath and made a decision. I wasn't going to play this game. "Dr. Whitman," I said calmly, "I appreciate that you're trying to facilitate communication, but I want to be clear about something. This isn't about hurt feelings or childhood resentment. This is about my children being told publicly that they aren't important enough to be at a family event. That's not a feeling I'm having. That's a thing that happened." I saw Victoria's face tighten, but I continued. "My response to that incident isn't emotional withdrawal. It's establishing boundaries. I'm making a clear-headed decision that my children will not be exposed to treatment that teaches them they're less valuable than other family members." I turned to Victoria. You asked what you did wrong. At Emma's birthday party, you humiliated my children in front of guests. You told them they weren't important enough to be there. Everything since then has been me deciding that won't happen again. I looked back at Dr. Whitman. I understand this session was framed as addressing my emotional struggles or family tensions. But I'm not emotionally struggling. I'm not harboring childhood resentment. I'm making rational decisions about protecting my children from specific documented mistreatment. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Whitman's expression had shifted from therapeutic concern to something more uncertain. Victoria's tears had stopped her face, now showing anger barely contained behind a mask of hurt confusion. Megan, that's a very serious accusation. My mother started, but James cut in quietly. It's not an accusation. It's a statement of fact. I was there. I recorded the incident on my phone because I sensed it was escalating. Would you like to hear what was actually said? Victoria had weaponized therapy itself, turning healing language into a tool of control, but Megan's refusal to accept the premise of her own brokenness had exposed the manipulation so clearly that even the therapist seemed to recognize she'd been used as an unwitting accomplice in a family power struggle. The therapy session should have been an ending, or at least a turning point, but Victoria had never intended it to resolve anything. It was theater designed to establish a public record of her concern and my instability. And in the weeks that followed, I watched her use that performance to devastating effect on the people who mattered most, my children. The first sign came when Lily mentioned casually that she hadn't been invited to her cousin Sarah's birthday party. Sarah was Daniel's daughter, and Lily and Sarah had always been close, spending time together at family gatherings, trading books and inside jokes. "Did you get your invitation yet?" Lily asked me one afternoon. When I called Daniel to inquire, the awkward pause before he answered told me everything. "Sarah's mom decided to keep it small this year," he said carefully. "Just a few kids from school." But I knew from Lily that Sarah was having a party at a trampoline park with 15 children. My daughter just wasn't one of them. Then Marcus came home from a school event, a fall festival where multiple families from the neighborhood attended, looking quieter than usual. When I asked if he'd had fun, he shrugged. Aunt Rachel was there with Emma and Tyler. She saw me, but she didn't say hi. She talked to the other parents, but not to Dad. Marcus was 8 years old, and he was learning what it felt like to be deliberately ignored, to stand close enough to hear adult conversation, but be excluded from acknowledgement. He was learning the same lessons I'd learned at his age, and watching it happen felt like having my own heart broken in real time. The worst moment came 2 weeks after the therapy session. Lily came home from school with red-rimmed eyes she was trying to hide. When I pressed gently, she finally told me what had happened. Her cousin Emma had been at school for a joint event between their two schools. Another girl had asked Lily why she hadn't been at Emma's birthday party months ago. Emma had answered before Lily could. "My mom said Lily's mom is causing problems for the family. She said Aunt Megan is making everyone upset and we shouldn't encourage it." The words had been said within Lily's hearing, possibly deliberately. Emma was 12, old enough to understand the cruelty of what she was saying, but also young enough to be repeating what she'd heard at home. Victoria had weaponized her own daughter, using a child to deliver messages that hurt another child. Lily looked at me with confusion and pain in her eyes. "Mom, what did you do? Why is everyone mad at you? Why are they mad at us?" I held my daughter while she cried and felt something inside me shift from calculated strategy to protective fury. My children were being punished for my refusal to stay small. They were experiencing social exclusion, whispered comments, the cold shoulder from adults who should have been supporting them. All because I had dared to set boundaries to protect them, to refuse to accept humiliation as the price of family membership. That night, after both children were finally asleep, I sat in the dark living room and let myself acknowledge what I'd been avoiding. My strategic approach, waiting for the audit to complete, building an unassailable case, ensuring clean legal standing, was taking too long. My children were suffering right now. Every day I waited for perfect timing was another day. Lily wondered what she'd done wrong. Another day Marcus learned to expect rejection. James found me at 2 in the morning, still sitting in the dark. I thought I was protecting them by being strategic, I told him, my voice breaking. I thought if I built the perfect case, if I waited for official documentation, if I did everything right, it would be clean and quick and they'd barely be affected. But they're being hurt right now while I wait for perfect timing. What kind of mother lets her children suffer for a plan? He sat beside me and said quietly, the kind of mother who's trying to do this right. But maybe right doesn't mean perfect. Maybe right means fast enough to stop the damage. We talked until dawn, weighing options, calculating risks. By the time the sun came up, I'd made my decision. I called Patricia Chen, my attorney, as soon as her office opened. If I present Linda Morrison's evidence now before the audit completes, what legal standing do I have? Patricia was quiet for a moment, considering. It's less clean than waiting for official audit findings, she admitted. But it's still substantial. Linda was the CFO, she has documentary evidence, and her terminal illness actually strengthens her credibility. She has no motive to lie. The audit will eventually confirm what she's already documented. You're just accelerating the timeline. Will it hold up? I asked. In court, if it comes to that? Patricia's response was measured but confident. Yes. You have enough for a credible claim of fraud and misrepresentation. The question isn't whether you can prove it. The question is whether you want to force a confrontation before the official process completes. Next, I called Sarah Mitchell. I'm ready to talk, I told her. On the record with complete documentation, but I need you to agree to certain conditions about how this story is framed. My children are involved in this, and I won't have them become collateral damage in a media narrative. Sarah listened as I outlined my requirements. Focus on the business fraud, not family drama. Interview Linda Morrison to establish independent corroboration. Give my parents opportunity to respond, but don't allow them to deflect onto my supposed instability. I can work with that, Sarah said. How soon can we meet? I looked at the calendar at the audit completion date, still 6 weeks away, and said, tomorrow. The moment Megan stopped waiting for the perfect time and started acting on necessary time. She could feel the shift from defense to offense, from reacting to initiating, and once that line was crossed, there would be no opportunity to unring the bell that was about to sound. While I was preparing to meet with Sarah Mitchell and accelerate my timeline, James had been working on something I didn't fully understand until he explained it over dinner 3 nights after my decision to act. I've been thinking, he said carefully, about how to make Victoria expose herself without us having to directly attack. And I think I found a way. He'd been in contact with an investment group called Meridian Capital Partners through his professional network. Not directly, and not in any way that could be traced back to us, but through legitimate channels. He'd mentioned in a conversation with a colleague who consulted for Meridian that Victoria's company had interesting expansion potential, but that anyone considering investment should take a very close look at ownership structure and historical intellectual property attribution. That was all. No accusations, no details, just a suggestion that careful due diligence would be wise. Meridian had done their own research and found the company genuinely attractive. Strong growth trajectory, solid market position, innovative business model. They'd reached out to Victoria directly about a potential $10 million investment. James showed me the email chain he'd obtained through his contact. It was all completely professional, no indication that we were involved in any way. This is brilliant, I said, slowly understanding the trap. If she accepts the investment, they'll do due diligence. They'll find the discrepancies in the 2005 records. James nodded. And if she refuses a favorable investment offer with no good explanation, her board will question her judgment and transparency. Either way, she loses. I watched over the next 2 weeks as Victoria agonized over the decision. My mother mentioned it at a phone call, saying Victoria was dealing with an exciting but complex business opportunity and spending long hours with her legal team. Daniel texted me that he'd overheard Victoria on the phone at a family gathering speaking tersely with someone about historical documentation standards and acceptable risk levels. Victoria was trapped between 2 bad options: And I knew what she was thinking because I understood how her mind worked. She believed the 2005 records had been adequately sanitized years ago. She thought any problematic original documents had been destroyed or replaced with updated versions that credited her appropriately. She'd convinced herself over 20 years that the official story was the real story, that any irregularities had been resolved through normal business documentation processes. What she didn't know was that Linda Morrison had kept everything. The originals, the emails, the dated proposals with my handwriting, the financial documents showing exactly how the fraud had been executed. Victoria thought she'd buried the truth deep enough that even professional forensic review wouldn't find it. She was wrong. I learned from my father, who mentioned it with proud relief during a Sunday dinner I attended, that Victoria had accepted Meridian's investment offer. She was hesitant at first. My father said, not understanding the significance of what he was revealing. She wanted to make sure the terms were right. But it's a wonderful opportunity for the company. $10 million for expansion. Victoria's worked so hard to build that business, and this validates everything she's done. I kept my expression neutral, made appropriate congratulatory sounds, and caught James's eye across the table. He gave me the smallest nod. The trap had been set, and Victoria had walked directly into it. Meridian's due diligence team began their work immediately. They were thorough, professional, and completely standard in their approach. They required documentation of all intellectual property that drove current company value, historical records of IP development and ownership transfers, and verification that the company had clear title to all innovations that formed the basis of its business model. Victoria provided the official documents, the sanitized versions that credited her with the 2005 sustainable fashion proposal. But Meridian's team, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, reached out to former employees listed in company records from that period to verify attribution and development processes. One of those former employees was Linda Morrison. Linda called me the day Meridian contacted her. Her voice was even weaker than before, but she sounded almost excited. "They want me to provide information about intellectual property development in 2005. She said. "I told them I'd be happy to clarify the historical record. I'm sending them everything." "Are you sure?" I asked. "Once you do this, there's no taking it back. Victoria will know you betrayed her." Linda's laugh was bitter and phlegmy. "I'm dying, Megan. I have maybe 3 months left. What can she do to me? And honestly, sending these documents to professional investigators who will understand exactly what they're seeing. It feels right. Not vengeful, just accurate." I sat in my car after that call, hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Victoria had signed the investment agreement, believing she'd secured her company's future, believing she'd finally caught a break after months of mounting pressure. She had no idea she'd just authorized a forensic examination of the one period in company history where the truth had been carefully buried but never quite erased. And I knew exactly where the bodies were buried, because I'd been the one buried alive. Victoria signed the investment agreement, believing she'd secured her company's future and her own vindication, never suspecting she'd just authorized a forensic examination of the one period in company history where the truth had been carefully buried, but never quite erased. And someone who knew exactly where the bodies were buried was waiting patiently for the excavation to begin. Linda Morrison sent her complete archive to Meridian Capital on a Tuesday afternoon. She called to tell me she'd done it, and I could hear both relief and exhaustion in her weakening voice. "It's done," she said simply. "Whatever happens now, I've told the truth." I thanked her, told her she was brave, and after we hung up, I sat very still, understanding that the machinery of exposure had been set fully in motion, and there was no stopping it now. Meridian's forensic team worked with the efficiency of professionals who did this for a living. Within 2 weeks, James's contact told him they'd flagged multiple irregularities that required clarification. The company formation documents from 2005 listed the initial business plan author as M. James, my maiden name, but current intellectual property registers credited Victoria exclusively for all foundational innovations. Tax filings from 2006 claimed significant value for intellectual property contributed to the company, but the documentation of who contributed what was vague at best, contradictory at worst. And buried in old email servers that Victoria had apparently forgotten existed were multiple message threads from late 2005 referring to the James proposal, without specifying which James sister had created it. None of these individually were smoking guns. They were questions. Professional investigators asking reasonable questions that required clear answers. And Victoria, who'd spent 20 years confident that the truth was buried deeply enough, was suddenly facing forensic scrutiny she wasn't prepared for. I learned about the meeting from my father, who mentioned it during a phone call without understanding what he was revealing. "Victoria has a big meeting with the investment people this week," he said. "Something about clarifying historical records. She seems stressed about it, but I'm sure it's just normal business complexity." I made sympathetic sounds and said nothing about the fact that I knew exactly what that meeting was about. Victoria went into that meeting with her legal team and her current interim CFO. She still hadn't replaced David Park permanently. According to what Daniel later told me, he'd heard it from his wife, who'd heard it from an aunt who'd somehow gotten the story from my mother. The meeting had not gone well. Victoria had tried to explain the discrepancies as administrative errors. James was a clerical mistake, she'd apparently said. The proposal was always mine, but some early documentation got confused because my sister and I worked on it together as a family project. Administrative staff weren't always clear about attribution. But Meridian's lead investigator wasn't easily satisfied. He'd asked pointed follow-up questions. If Megan contributed to the proposal even as part of a family project, did she have any intellectual property rights? Could she potentially claim partial ownership? Had she been compensated for her contribution? Victoria's answers, according to Daniel's account, had been defensive and increasingly strained. "My sister was 17 at the time. She wasn't meaningfully involved. She's never claimed ownership. This is a non-issue." But the more Victoria insisted it was a non-issue, the more Meridian's team took notes about potential legal exposure. The investigators hadn't accused Victoria of fraud. They'd simply flagged the inconsistencies as risk factors that needed resolution before the investment could proceed. But that professional restraint almost made it worse. It meant they were treating this as a serious concern, not something that could be dismissed or explained away with charm and confidence. Within days, word had spread to Victoria's board of directors that the investment deal was encountering complications around historical IP documentation. Board members began calling Victoria privately, asking questions they'd never asked before. "Do we have clean title to our core business methodologies? Could there be claims from former employees or contributors we don't know about?" Victoria assured them everything was fine, but several board members later told colleagues that her reassurances had been less confident than usual, more defensive than explanatory. Worse for Victoria, Meridian's investigators had done what thorough professionals do. They'd contacted the company founders directly to verify information. My parents received a call one afternoon asking if they could clarify which family member had created the 2005 sustainable fashion proposal that had saved the company. My mother, caught completely off guard and not having coordinated a story with Victoria, had given hesitant, vague answers. It was a family effort. Both daughters contributed ideas. Victoria was the one who presented it professionally. My father, equally unprepared, had said something slightly different. The proposal came from Megan originally, but Victoria developed it for business implementation. These small inconsistencies between Victoria's version, my mother's version, and my father's version weren't dramatic contradictions. But to professional investigators trained to spot fraud, they were red flags. Why couldn't a family give a consistent account of something supposedly so straightforward? Why did each person tell the story slightly differently? Why was there defensiveness around questions that should have simple answers? I watched all of this unfold from a distance, hearing pieces through family members who didn't understand what they were witnessing, through James's professional contacts, through Daniel's concerned updates. I wasn't doing anything at this point except watching Victoria's carefully constructed narrative crumble under the weight of professional scrutiny. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria had spent decades controlling narratives, managing perceptions, ensuring everyone believed her version of reality. She'd been brilliant at it because she'd always controlled the audience, family members inclined to believe her, social circles impressed by her success, business contacts, who saw only the polished exterior. But now she was facing an audience she couldn't charm or manipulate. Forensic accountants and due diligence investigators didn't care about family dynamics or social status. They cared about documentation, consistency, and legal liability. And under that cold professional scrutiny, every small lie, every half-truth, every carefully maintained inconsistency became a question that demanded answers Victoria couldn't provide without exposing the larger fraud. Once the first crack appeared in Victoria's carefully maintained facade, it became impossible to stop the spread. Each explanation created new questions. Each question revealed new inconsistencies, and the very perfectionism she'd used as armor was now the magnifying glass under which her entire foundation was being examined with ruthless professional scrutiny. While Victoria's professional world was crumbling under Meridian's scrutiny, she made one final desperate move that crossed a line I hadn't imagined even she would cross. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was working from home. The woman identified herself as Jennifer Torres from Child Protective Services, and I felt the world tilt before she even explained why she was calling. "We've received a report expressing concerns about your children's well-being," she said in the carefully neutral tone that professionals use when delivering devastating news. The complaint alleges emotional manipulation, isolation from extended family, and creating a toxic environment by teaching your children to hate relatives. We need to schedule a home visit to investigate these concerns. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except repeat numbly, "A report. Someone reported me to CPS." Jennifer explained that the complaint was filed anonymously, as was often the case, and that I shouldn't view this as an accusation but as a process to ensure child safety. She scheduled a home visit for the following Tuesday and told me what to expect. After she hung up, I sat frozen, staring at nothing until James came home and found me still sitting in the same position 2 hours later. "Victoria did this," I said when I could finally speak. James's jaw tightened, but he didn't disagree. We both understood immediately. Victoria hadn't filed the report directly, that would be too traceable, but she'd expressed concerns to someone in social services, probably framing it as worried family intervention, and that person had been obligated to file. It was brilliant in its cruelty. The investigation itself was confidential, but if word somehow leaked that I was being investigated by CPS, my professional reputation would be destroyed, regardless of the outcome. Jennifer Torres arrived on Tuesday with a colleague, both of them professional and courteous, but thorough. They toured our home, noting its cleanliness and organization. They reviewed our children's rooms, their schoolwork, their medical records. They interviewed James and me together, then separately. The house was fine. The children were clearly healthy, well cared for, thriving in school. But then Jennifer asked to interview Lily and Marcus individually, and my stomach dropped. I waited in the living room while Jennifer spoke with each child in their bedroom. The interviews lasted about 20 minutes each. When they emerged, Jennifer's expression was neutral, revealing nothing. She thanked us for our cooperation and said she'd be in touch after completing her investigation. After she left, I asked the children what they'd talked about. Lily shrugged, said it was just questions about family and school. Marcus said the lady was nice and wanted to know if he was happy. But 2 weeks later, when Jennifer called to schedule a follow-up interview with me alone, I learned what my children had actually said. Jennifer's questions revealed the problem. Lily had told her that Mom said we don't have to see people who hurt us. Marcus had said he didn't like family events because they don't want us there. These statements were true. They were also removed from context, damning evidence that I was alienating my children from their family. "Can you explain your approach to family relationships?" Jennifer asked, her pen poised over her notepad. I tried to articulate the difference between teaching healthy boundaries and teaching hatred, between protecting children from harm and isolating them out of vindictiveness. but I could hear how it might sound a mother so consumed by her own grievances that she was damaging her children's capacity for healthy relationships. I lived for 6 weeks in a state of barely controlled terror, imagining worst-case scenarios where my children were removed from my home, where I was labeled an unfit mother, where Victoria had finally found the weapon that would destroy me completely. Then James did what he does best. He gathered evidence. He showed Jennifer the recording from the birthday party 6 months ago, where Victoria's voice came through clearly. "Your children aren't really important enough to be here, but we're being generous." He provided a detailed timeline showing that my boundary setting began only after that public humiliation, not before. He brought character references from Lily and Marcus's teachers, from our neighbors, from my professional colleagues. He compiled evidence that painted a complete picture not of a vindictive mother poisoning her children against family, but of a protective mother responding reasonably to documented mistreatment. Most importantly, he sat with Jennifer and explained context that my children couldn't articulate. "My wife isn't isolating our children from loving family," he said calmly. "She's protecting them from family members who publicly humiliate them. When my daughter says, 'We don't have to see people who hurt us,' she's not being taught to hate. She's being taught that she deserves respect. That's not parental alienation. That's basic protection." Jennifer completed her investigation 8 weeks after the initial call. The determination was unfounded. No evidence of abuse, neglect, or inappropriate parenting. My decisions appeared to be reasonable responses to documented family conflict. The file would be closed. But the experience had scarred me in ways that would take years to heal. For 8 weeks, I'd lived with the possibility of losing my children. Victoria had been willing to traumatize 2 innocent children, to subject them to CPS interviews and investigation just to maintain her position and destroy my credibility. The CPS investigation cleared Megan of any wrongdoing, but it had accomplished something more important than Victoria intended. It removed the last shred of guilt Megan felt about what was coming next, because a woman who would weaponize child welfare services against innocent children had surrendered any claim to protection or mercy. When the CPS investigation cleared me, I called Linda Morrison to tell her what Victoria had done. Her breathing was labored and I could hear the hospice equipment in the background. She was dying, and we both knew it would be soon. "She used children," Linda said, her voice weak but furious. "She weaponized child welfare against innocent children to protect her lie." There was a long pause, then, "I'm calling Meridian Capital myself. They need to hear directly from me, and they need everything I have. No more waiting." Linda contacted Meridian's lead investigator that afternoon and offered herself as a witness, a subject matter expert who'd been directly involved in the 2005 intellectual property decisions. She told them, the former CFO who'd processed the fraudulent documentation, and she was dying, which meant she had no reason to lie and nothing to gain except peace of conscience. Meridian scheduled a video conference for the next day, and Linda spent her remaining energy organizing 2 decades of evidence into a coherent narrative. I wasn't present for Linda's testimony, but Meridian's investigator later described it to Sarah Mitchell, who included details in her article. Linda had been methodical, professional, and devastatingly credible. She'd shown them my original proposal with my handwriting and date stamps. She'd walked them through the internal emails where my parents explicitly discussed having Victoria present my work as her own to make it more credible to investors. She'd provided financial documents showing the $2 million investment secured using my proposal, but credited entirely to Victoria. And she'd given a sworn statement that she was willing to testify in any legal proceeding, understanding fully the implications for the company and the family. Linda died 4 days after that testimony, and I attended her funeral, feeling a complicated mix of grief and gratitude. She'd carried guilt for 20 years, and in her final weeks, she'd chosen truth over comfort. Whatever else she'd done wrong, she'd tried to make it right at the end. Within a week of Linda's testimony, everything converged at once. The trust fund audit finally completed, and its findings mirrored exactly what Linda had documented: significant discrepancies in 2005 intellectual property attribution, with evidence suggesting the original creator was Megan James, not Victoria. Meridian Capital formally suspended their investment offer pending resolution of material questions about ownership and potential fraud liability. Sarah Mitchell published her article in the Business Ethics Journal under the headline, "When Family Business Success Has Complicated Origins, an Investigation into IP Attribution." She didn't make direct fraud accusations, but she raised questions that anyone in business would recognize as serious red flags. And Daniel, my quiet brother who'd spent his life avoiding conflict, finally decided he couldn't stay silent anymore. He called several family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, and told them about the conversation he'd overheard in 2007 about our parents' guilt about the inconsistencies he'd observed for years. He didn't accuse or interpret. He just shared what he knew and let them draw their own conclusions. My parents, overwhelmed by the convergence of evidence from sources they couldn't dismiss, called a family meeting. Not therapy this time, just family. They gathered everyone at their house on a Sunday afternoon, me and James, Victoria and her husband Daniel, and his wife and my parents looking older and more exhausted than I'd ever seen them. Victoria tried to control the meeting from the start. She stood in my parents' living room and delivered what I recognized as a prepared speech. "This is clearly a coordinated campaign," she said, her voice carrying that familiar confidence that had always worked before. "Megan has orchestrated this out of jealousy and resentment. Linda Morrison is a disgruntled former employee spreading lies. The audit findings are clerical errors being misinterpreted. And the journalist," she looked directly at me, "was obviously fed information by someone with an agenda." But this time, something was different. Daniel spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Victoria, you just said Megan wasn't involved in the proposal at all. But at the Meridian meeting you said you and Megan worked on it together as a family project. Which is it?" Victoria's face flushed. "I meant, that's not, you're twisting my words." "Linda Morrison wasn't fired," Daniel continued. "She retired voluntarily after 8 years. I checked. And the audit findings aren't coming from one source, they're consistent across multiple independent investigations. How do you explain that?" Victoria turned to our parents, expecting them to support her, to shut down this questioning like they always had. But they sat frozen. My mother's hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. My father staring at the floor. "Mom, Dad," Victoria's voice carried a note of panic now. Tell them this is ridiculous." My father finally looked up, and what I saw in his face was complete defeat. "We can't, Victoria, because it's not ridiculous. It's true." The room went absolutely silent. Victoria stared at our father as if he'd physically struck her. My mother started crying softly, her hands covering her face. "We took Megan's proposal," my father continued, his voice breaking. "We knew it was hers. We had you present it because we thought investors wouldn't take a 17-year-old seriously. We told ourselves it was temporary, that we'd explain later that we were protecting Megan. But we never did. We just let it become the story. And every year it got harder to tell the truth." Silence filled the room. Not the complicit silence that had protected lies for 20 years. But the heavy silence of people realizing they'd participated in injustice and didn't know how to make it right, while Victoria watched her carefully constructed world crack apart under the weight of a truth that had always existed, but finally, irrevocably, could no longer be ignored. After my father's confession hung in the air, I stood up slowly and walked to my bag. I'd brought everything organized into folders, anticipating this moment, even though part of me had hoped it wouldn't be necessary. I placed the stack of documents on the coffee table, 20 years of evidence carefully archived by a dying woman who'd carried guilt she couldn't shed. "I want to show you what actually happened," I said quietly. "Not my version or Victoria's version, just the facts. I opened the first folder and spread out copies of my original proposal from 2005. The pages showed my 17-year-old handwriting my signature, the date stamp from my school project. Beside them, I placed the company documents that credited Victoria as the sole creator. The handwriting was different. The attribution was different. Everything was different except the content, which was identical. I walked them through Linda Morrison's documentation, the internal emails where my parents discussed how to handle the attribution issue, the meeting minutes where they decided Victoria should present the proposal because I was too young to be taken seriously, the financial records showing the $2 million investment secured using my work. I showed them compensation records proving Victoria received salary increases, equity grants, and public recognition, all justified by her innovative contribution that saved the company. I wasn't dramatic. I didn't raise my voice. I simply presented facts, and the facts spoke for themselves. When I finally looked up, my mother was crying silently. My father had his head in his hands, and Victoria sat frozen, her face pale. "I understand why you did it initially," I said, addressing my parents directly. "I was 17. I had no business experience. Investors wouldn't have taken me seriously. You thought you were making a practical decision to save the company, but you never told me." My voice remained steady, though I felt tears burning behind my eyes. "You let me believe my ideas weren't valuable. You let me spend 20 years thinking I was the less capable daughter, the one who didn't matter. You taught me to take up less space, to want less, to expect less. That was the real harm. Not the stolen credit, but the stolen sense of self." My mother finally spoke, her voice breaking with sobs she could no longer control. "We were going to tell you. When you turned 21, we planned everything. We were going to give you equity in the company as compensation, explain what had happened, make it right. But by then," she struggled to continue. "By then the company had grown so much. Victoria's entire identity was tied to being the creator of that proposal. Articles had been written about her innovative vision. She'd built her reputation on it. And your father and I were terrified." "Terrified of what?" I asked quietly. My father looked up, his eyes red. "Lawsuits, scandal, destroying Victoria. We were afraid she'd fall apart if her foundation was revealed as not entirely hers. We were afraid the company would collapse. Every year that passed made it harder to tell the truth. We weren't malicious, Megan. We were cowards. We chose the easier path every single time." My father continued, his voice filled with regret I'd never heard before. "We convinced ourselves you were fine. You built a successful life. You seemed happy in your career. You had a good marriage. We told ourselves you didn't need the credit or the money. We told ourselves you'd be hurt more by the truth than by never knowing." He met my eyes. "We were wrong. We prioritized our comfort and Victoria's stability over your right to be seen and valued for who you really are." Victoria had been silent through all of this, but now she spoke, her voice raw. "I was 24 years old when this happened. I didn't steal your proposal, Megan. Mom and Dad gave it to me. They said you were too young, that investors wouldn't listen to a teenager, that I needed to present it to save the family company. I did what they asked me to do." Tears streamed down her face unchecked. "And yes, over time I convinced myself it really was mine, that I'd improved it enough, developed it enough that the credit was deserved. You never asked about it. You never seemed to care. So I told myself it must not have mattered to you." She looked at me directly for the first time. "But I knew. Deep down, I always knew. Every time I dismissed you, every time I made you feel small, every time I positioned myself above you, it was because I was terrified. Terrified you'd remember. Terrified you'd ask questions. Terrified you'd expose me and everything I'd built would be revealed as a lie." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I've lived in fear of this moment for 20 years. And the worst part is, I became cruel to protect a lie. I hurt you and your children to maintain something I knew was never really mine." The room was silent except for my mother's quiet crying. Daniel sat with his wife, watching all of us with an expression of profound sadness. James remained beside me, solid and present. Victoria's husband looked stunned, processing revelations about his wife's history he'd never known. And I stood there holding 20 years of evidence, understanding finally that there were no simple villains in this story. Just flawed people making progressively worse choices to avoid facing an original sin they'd committed out of expedience rather than malice. The truth was finally complete, laid bare in documents and confessions, and no one in that room could pretend anymore, not about what had happened, not about their own complicity, and not about the impossible question of how you repair damage when everyone involved is both victim and perpetrator depending on which moment you examine. The truth sat in the room like a living thing, and for several minutes after Victoria's confession, no one spoke. Finally, my mother asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What do you want, Megan? What would make this right?" But I didn't answer that night. I told them I needed time to think, to process everything that had been said. James and I gathered our things and left, and in the car on the way home, I felt strangely empty. I'd spent months building toward this moment of revelation, and now that it had arrived, I wasn't sure what came next. The professional consequences began unfolding within days, and I had nothing to do with any of them. Meridian Capital formally withdrew their investment offer, sending Victoria and the board a letter explaining that unresolved questions about intellectual property ownership and concerns about governance transparency made the investment too risky to proceed. The letter was professional, clinical, devastating. Without that $10 million, Victoria's planned expansion couldn't happen. The company would need to restructure, scale back, find alternative funding sources that would be harder to secure now that questions about their foundational IP were circulating in investment circles. The board of directors held an emergency meeting. I learned about it from my father, who was still technically on the board, though he'd been mostly retired for years. The discussion, he told me with defeated exhaustion, had been painful and thorough. Board members wanted answers about the IP attribution issues. They wanted to know if the company faced legal liability. They wanted to understand how governance had allowed this situation to persist for 20 years. And they wanted to know if Victoria, given what had emerged about her judgment and transparency, was still the right person to lead the company. The vote was close but decisive. Victoria would be removed as CEO, though she would retain her ownership shares and a seat on the board. An interim CEO would be appointed while they searched for permanent leadership. The official statement would cite strategic restructuring and new direction without mentioning the fraud protecting both the company and Victoria from public scandal. But within the industry, these things spread through networks and whispered conversations. Everyone who mattered would know, or at least suspect, why Victoria had really been removed. I watched this unfold from a distance, and I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. Victoria was finally facing consequences for 20 years of lies. But part of me felt sad because I remembered the girl she'd been before the pressure, and the lies had twisted her into someone capable of such cruelty. Victoria had been given an impossible burden at 24, and instead of truth and support, she'd been handed a lie to carry for the rest of her life. It had destroyed her almost as completely as it had destroyed me, just in different ways. Two of the company's major charity partners organizations Victoria had worked with for years, serving on their boards, organizing fundraisers, quietly distanced themselves. There was no public announcement, no scandal, just polite emails about organizational restructuring and new board composition needs. In the world of professional reputation, these quiet withdrawals spoke volumes. Victoria would no longer be invited to speak at business conferences. Her name would be removed from consideration for prestigious board positions. She hadn't been publicly destroyed, but she'd been professionally diminished, and in the circles she'd cared about most, that was a death of sorts. It took me 2 weeks to decide what I actually wanted. I met with Patricia Chen, my attorney, and we discussed legal options. I could sue for compensation for equity in the company for 20 years of lost recognition and opportunity. Patricia laid out the case methodically. I had grounds for fraud claims, unjust enrichment, potentially even punitive damages given the deliberate nature of the deception. But as she talked, I realized that money wasn't what I needed. I'd built my own success. I didn't need Victoria's company or my parents' wealth. What I needed was something simpler and more fundamental to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have the record corrected. When I finally sat down with my family again, this time at a neutral location, a conference room Patricia had arranged, I came with a written list of requirements. My parents looked older, worn down by guilt and fear. Victoria looked hollow, her usual polish completely gone. Daniel was there as a witness, as someone who could help hold everyone accountable to whatever we agreed. "I don't want money," I said, and I saw surprise flicker across multiple faces. "I don't want equity in the company. I don't want to destroy anyone's life or take what you've built, but I do need 3 things, and they're non-negotiable." I slid copies of my written requirements across the table. First, I need formal acknowledgement in the company's historical records that the 2005 business proposal that saved the company was created by me, Megan James, born Megan Porter, when I was 17 years old. The previous attribution to Victoria was incorrect. This acknowledgement will be placed in the company's official history, in any materials that reference the company's origin story, and in any future publications or materials that discuss the company's founding innovations. My mother started to cry again, but I continued. Second, I need an end to any family member characterizing me or my parenting decisions as problematic. No more whisper campaigns. No more expressing concerns about my mental health. No more suggestions that I'm holding grudges or being unreasonable. You will respect my boundaries without commentary, without trying to convince me I should be different. Victoria flinched but said nothing. I looked at my parents for the third requirement. Third, access to my children will be entirely on my terms going forward. If anyone, and I mean anyone, demonstrates disrespect toward my children, speaks negatively about me in their presence, or tries to undermine my parenting, that person will have supervised contact only or no contact at all, depending on the severity. My father nodded slowly. My mother whispered, "That's fair. That's all fair." But I wasn't finished. "There's one more thing. You established educational trust funds for Victoria's children. I want equivalent funds established for Lily and Marcus, not as payment. As acknowledgement that they were treated as less than, and that you're taking tangible action to correct that inequity going forward." I paused. "These aren't requests. These are requirements. If you can't agree to all of them, then we have nothing more to discuss, and you can expect legal action." The room was silent for a long moment. Then my father said, "We agree to all of it." Victoria looked at him betrayed, but he didn't back down. "We owe this to Megan. We've owed it for 20 years. It's time to pay that debt." Over the following months, I watched Victoria navigate a world where her identity had been stripped away. She still had money, her ownership shares in the company were worth millions. Her marriage survived, though I heard from Daniel that her husband had needed extensive therapy to process the revelation that his wife's entire professional reputation was built on fraud. Her children still loved her, though they were old enough to be confused and hurt by the sudden changes in their mother's life. But Victoria had lost something that couldn't be replaced with money or family loyalty. She'd lost herself. For 20 years she'd been Victoria James, the brilliant CEO who saved her family company with innovative vision. Every introduction, every professional bio, every social media post had reinforced that identity. She'd built her entire sense of worth on being exceptional, being special, being the daughter who succeeded. Now she was just Victoria, a woman who'd built her career on someone else's work, a woman who'd been removed from leadership. A woman who had to face the reality that everything she thought made her special had actually belonged to someone else. I saw her once at a coffee shop months after everything had settled. She looked smaller somehow, less polished. She saw me too, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw shame there and loss, and something that might have been the beginning of actual self-awareness. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. The consequences she was living with weren't about punishment. They were about reality finally catching up with lies that had been running unchallenged for 2 decades. She had her life, her family, her financial security. What she'd lost was the armor of false identity, and watching her try to figure out who she actually was without that armor was perhaps the most complete consequence of all. My parents aged visibly under the weight of their guilt. They tried to rebuild a relationship with me, but it would never be what it had been, or rather what I'd wished it had been. They were present for my children, but cautious, always aware that their access was conditional on their behavior. They'd learned finally and too late that love without respect isn't actually love at all. Justice had arrived not as dramatic destruction, but as quiet accountability. Victoria still had her life, her family, and her resources, but she no longer had the armor of lies to hide behind, and that exposure turned out to be the most complete consequence of all. The apologies began arriving within days of our family meeting, and they revealed more about the people offering them than they probably intended. My mother called first, her voice tentative and pleading. "Sweetheart, your father and I have been talking, and we want you to know how sorry we are. We did what we thought was best at the time. We were trying to protect you and save the company. We never meant to hurt you. We hope you can forgive us and we can move forward as a family." I listened to the entire speech, noting every deflection, every justification wrapped inside the apology. When she finished, I said calmly, "I appreciate that you're sorry, Mom. But saying you never meant to hurt me doesn't change the fact that you did, for 20 years. And saying you did what you thought was best doesn't make it right. It just means you convinced yourselves to choose the easy path instead of the honest one." The silence on the other end was heavy with disappointment. My mother had expected forgiveness, expected that an apology would reset our relationship to something resembling normalcy. When she spoke again, her voice carried hurt. "So you're not going to forgive us? After everything we've been through, you're just going to hold this grudge forever?" "Forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing," I told her. I can forgive you for being human and flawed while also recognizing that our relationship can't go back to what it was because what it was unhealthy. I need to see sustained, changed behavior before I can trust you again. And even then, things will be different." Victoria's apology came via email, which told me she still couldn't face me directly. It was longer than my mother's call, more detailed, but ultimately just as defensive. She wrote about how she'd been victimized by impossible expectations, how she'd been given an unfair burden at 24, how she'd lived with guilt and fear for 2 decades. "I'm sorry you felt diminished," she wrote, and that phrase alone told me she still didn't fully understand. I hadn't felt diminished. I had been diminished systematically and deliberately by choices my family made and maintained. I didn't respond to Victoria's email. There was nothing to say. She'd offered an apology that centered her own suffering rather than acknowledging mine, and until she could do better than that, we had nothing to discuss. Extended family members, aunts, uncles, cousins who'd participated in the collective dismissal of me over the years reached out with variations of the same message: "We didn't know. If we'd known what was really happening, we would have said something." It was true, but also convenient. They hadn't known the specifics of the fraud, but they'd known I was treated as less important. They'd known my children were excluded and dismissed. They'd known, and they'd said nothing because it was easier, more comfortable to go along with the family hierarchy than to question it. I thanked them for their messages, but made no promises about future relationships. Some of them seemed to understand. Others were hurt that I wasn't immediately welcoming them back into my life with open arms. What I was learning painfully and slowly was that apologies without changed behavior were just words. They made the apologizer feel better, but did nothing to repair the actual damage or prevent future harm. So I stopped accepting apologies at face value and started watching for action. I created a document outlining the new terms of engagement for family relationships. James helped me refine it, making sure it was clear but not cruel, firm but not vindictive. I sent it to everyone in the family, and the response was mixed. The guidelines were specific. My parents could see their grandchildren, but visits had to be scheduled at least 1 week in advance. For the first 3 months, these visits would be supervised by either James or me. No dropping by unannounced, no last-minute invitations, no attempts to see the children without going through us first. Family gatherings were conditional. I would consider attending if the event was at a neutral location, if there was a clear purpose beyond forcing family togetherness, and if Victoria was not present. This last condition sparked the most controversy. My mother called upset. "You can't just ban your sister from family events. That's not fair to her or to anyone else." "I'm not banning anyone from anything," I explained patiently. "I'm making my attendance conditional on my own safety and comfort. If Victoria is there, I won't be. Everyone else can make their own choices about who they want to see." My mother tried to argue that this was forcing the family to choose sides, but I held firm. "You've been choosing sides my entire life. Now I'm simply removing myself from situations where I'm likely to be hurt. That's not manipulation. That's self-protection." The document also addressed how my children should be treated. Anyone who criticized my parenting made passive-aggressive comments about my boundaries or tried to pressure my children to show affection they didn't feel would have their contact reduced or eliminated entirely. I included specific examples. Don't tell my children they should forgive and forget, or that family is everything, or that I'm being too harsh. Don't ask them to carry messages to me. Don't use them as intermediaries in adult conflicts. Some family members found these conditions harsh. An aunt sent me a long message about how I was being controlling, how healthy families don't operate with written rules, how I was teaching my children to hold grudges. I responded simply, "These boundaries protect everyone. They protect me from being hurt again, and they protect you from my resentment. If you can't respect them, that tells me you're not actually safe for me to have a relationship with." But not everyone responded negatively. Daniel called me the day after I sent the guidelines. "I've read through everything, and I want you to know I support all of it. Whatever you need from me to feel safe, I'll do it. And if I mess up, tell me directly so I can fix it." His straightforward acceptance without defensiveness or justification meant more to me than he probably realized. Daniel became the model for what healthy family relationship could look like in the aftermath of massive betrayal. He didn't pressure me to forgive faster or forget sooner. He didn't minimize what had happened or make excuses for anyone. When we got together for coffee or when our families spent time together, he listened more than he talked. He asked questions about how I was really doing, not just surface level, "Are you okay?" but genuine inquiry into my emotional state. Most importantly, Daniel apologized not just for what he'd done, but for what he'd failed to do. "I'm sorry I stayed silent when I should have spoken up," he told me during one of our coffee meetings. "I'm sorry I benefited from family peace that was purchased at your expense. I'm sorry I didn't defend you to other family members when they dismissed you. I knew it was wrong and I said nothing, and that makes me complicit." His apology was specific, taking accountability for actual actions and inactions. It wasn't vague, "Sorry for any hurt I caused," or defensive, "Sorry you felt that way." It was real. And because it was real, I could begin to rebuild trust with him. Our children started spending time together, Lily and Marcus, with Daniel's 2 daughters. These cousin relationships developed differently than the toxic dynamics of the previous generation. There was no hierarchy, no golden child versus forgotten child. The kids just played together, shared books and games, had sleepovers at each other's houses. Watching them, I felt hope for the first time in months. The cycle could be broken. My children could have family relationships that were healthy and mutual, even if mine couldn't be fully repaired. Through Daniel, I learned what I'd been missing my entire life: authentic family connection. Relationships where you could be vulnerable without fear of exploitation. Where disagreement didn't mean exile. Where you were valued for who you were, not for how well you stayed in your assigned role. 3 months after implementing my boundaries, my mother called to ask if we could have dinner together, just her, my father, James, and me. No children, no extended family, just the 4 of us. She wanted to talk. She said not to convince me of anything, but to listen. I agreed cautiously. At that dinner, my parents did something they'd never done before. They listened without defending. They heard me describe what it had felt like to grow up as the forgotten daughter. They didn't interrupt to explain their intentions or justify their choices. When I talked about watching my children experience the same dismissal, my mother cried silently but didn't try to shift focus to her own pain. When I explained why I couldn't just move on or let it go, my father nodded and said, "I understand. We don't deserve your forgiveness, but we want to earn the chance to try." It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even close to reconciliation. But it was the beginning of something more honest than we'd ever had before. Forgiveness. Megan learned wasn't a gift she owed anyone, and reconciliation wasn't an obligation. They were possibilities that required trust, and trust had to be earned through consistent changed behavior over time, not granted instantly because someone finally admitted to wrongdoing they'd denied for decades. As boundaries were established with the extended family, I turned my full attention to what mattered most: my children. Lily and Marcus had been through something they were too young to fully understand, but old enough to be affected by. They'd watched family dynamics explode, heard raised voices, and seen tears, felt the tension even when adults tried to hide it. And they deserved to understand what had happened in ways that would help them, not hurt them further. I sat down with each of them separately first, then together over several conversations spaced across weeks. With Marcus, who was 8, I kept it simple and concrete. "Remember at Emma's birthday party when Aunt Victoria said something that hurt your feelings?" He nodded, his face darkening at the memory. "Well, what she said was wrong. Adults aren't supposed to make children feel unimportant. And when I asked her to apologize and promise not to do it again, she couldn't. So I decided we needed space from parts of the family until we feel safe again." Marcus thought about this carefully, then asked, "Is it because I did something wrong?" My heart broke a little. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. This is about adults making bad choices. Sometimes when grown-ups can't treat people with kindness, we have to create distance to protect ourselves. That's not punishment for you. That's protection." With Lily, who was 12 and understood more, the conversation was more complex. She had questions I'd anticipated and some I hadn't. "Are we ever going to see Grandma and Grandpa normally again?" she asked. "Or Aunt Victoria? What about Emma and the other cousins?" I answered honestly. "We'll see Grandma and Grandpa, but differently than before. They need to show us they understand why what happened was wrong, and that they'll treat us with respect going forward. As for Aunt Victoria, I don't know yet. She has a lot of work to do on herself before I feel comfortable having her around you and Marcus." I paused. "And I know this means missing out on some family events. I know other kids get to see their cousins whenever they want. I'm sorry that this situation is taking that away from you." Lily was quiet for a long moment. "But we're missing out because we're protecting ourselves, right? Not because we did something wrong." I pulled her close. "Exactly. We're choosing what we're protecting over what we're missing. And what we're protecting, your sense that you're valuable, that you deserve respect, that no one gets to make you feel less than, that's more important than any party or gathering." She rested her head on my shoulder. "At school, my teacher talks about boundaries being healthy. Is that what this is?" I smiled. "Yes, this is what healthy boundaries look like in real life. Sometimes they're uncomfortable. Sometimes they mean missing out on things. But they protect something more important than comfort or inclusion. They protect who you are." But I also knew that conversations alone weren't enough. Children learn more from what they see than what they're told. So I became hyper-aware of modeling the values I wanted them to internalize. They watched me set boundaries with family members calmly, firmly, without cruelty. When my mother called crying, begging for more time with the grandchildren, Lily overheard me say, "Mom, I understand you're sad, but my job is to protect my children, not to make you feel better. When you can demonstrate consistent respect for our boundaries, we'll revisit this." Later, Lily asked me about it. "Wasn't Grandma crying? Didn't that make you feel bad?" I nodded. "Yes, it made me feel bad. But feeling bad doesn't mean I made the wrong choice. Sometimes doing what's right makes us feel uncomfortable, and we have to learn to sit with that discomfort without changing our boundaries to make other people comfortable." My children also watched me refuse to be vindictive even when I had every right to be angry. When Victoria's removal from the CEO position became semi-public knowledge and a family friend made a snide comment at a school event about karma catching up, I didn't engage. I simply said, "That's a family matter we're dealing with privately," and changed the subject. Later, Marcus asked why I hadn't agreed with the woman who said Aunt Victoria deserved it. I crouched down to his eye level. Because being right doesn't give us permission to be mean. Aunt Victoria is facing consequences for her choices, and that's appropriate. But I don't need to celebrate her pain or make it worse. There's a difference between protecting yourself and being cruel, and I never want you to confuse the two. They watched me grieve too, and I let them see that. One evening, going through old photo albums with James, I came across pictures from childhood me and Victoria at the beach, both of us young and smiling before everything became complicated. I cried, and Lily found me. "Are you sad about Aunt Victoria?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm sad about what could have been. I'm sad that our family couldn't be healthier. I'm sad that she made choices that hurt us. It's okay to be sad about loss, even when you know you made the right decision." "So you can miss someone and still not want them in your life?" Lily asked. It was such a perceptive question. "Yes, you can love someone and still recognize they're not safe for you to be around. Feelings are complicated. We can hold sadness and certainty at the same time." The most important modeling happened in quieter moments. Marcus asked one afternoon, seemingly out of nowhere, "Mommy, am I enough?" I stopped what I was doing and gave him my complete attention. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He struggled to articulate it. Like, am I enough the way I am, or do I need to be different for people to like me? I realized with a jolt that he was processing lessons he'd absorbed from watching family dynamics, the same lessons I'd learned at his age. That you had to earn love, that you had to be exceptional to matter, that just existing wasn't sufficient justification for taking up space. I pulled him onto my lap, even though he was getting too big for it. "You are enough exactly as you are right now. You don't need to be smarter or funnier or more talented or anything other than yourself for me to love you, for Dad to love you, for the people who truly care about you to value you. The people who made you feel like you weren't enough, they were wrong, and that's about their limitations, not yours." I also got both children into therapy, which surprised some family members who viewed it as dramatic or unnecessary. But I explained to anyone who questioned it, they're not in therapy because they're damaged. They're in therapy to process what they experienced and develop healthy frameworks for understanding difficult family dynamics. I'm giving them tools I didn't have. The therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, was wonderful, warm, but direct, skilled at helping children articulate complex emotions. After several months of sessions, Dr. Kim told me that both children were processing the situation remarkably well. "You've done something very important," she said. "You've helped them understand that adults can make mistakes, that families can be complicated, and that protecting yourself doesn't make you the bad guy. Those are lessons that will serve them their entire lives." Through all of this, James remained my anchor without being my savior. He didn't try to fix everything or shield me from the painful parts. When I needed to cry, he held me. When I needed to talk through decisions, he listened and asked good questions. When I needed him to handle something because I was overwhelmed, he stepped in. But he never took over. He never made this about what he thought I should do. One night after the children were asleep and we were sitting together in the quiet, I thanked him for everything he'd done over the past months. "You gathered all that information, you made strategic suggestions, you supported me through every decision. I couldn't have done this without you." He shook his head slightly. "You absolutely could have. You would have done it differently, maybe slower, but you would have gotten here. All I did was provide options. You're the one who decided what justice looked like for you. You're the one who chose dignity over destruction, boundaries over revenge. I'm proud of you for that." His words made me realize something important. This entire situation could have destroyed me. It could have made me bitter, vindictive, consumed by anger. And there were moments when I felt all of those things. But I'd chosen consistently and deliberately to channel those feelings into protection rather than punishment. I'd chosen to model for my children what it looked like to stand up for yourself without becoming the villain in your own story. I think the hardest part, I told James, was accepting that I couldn't have the family I wanted. I had to grieve that fantasy before I could deal with the family I actually have. He nodded. But you're giving our children something better. You're showing them that they don't have to accept dysfunction just because it's family. That they get to choose who has access to their life based on how those people treat them. Months later, I overheard a conversation between Lily and one of her friends that confirmed I was doing something right. The friend was complaining about her grandmother who was always criticizing everything and making her feel bad. Lily said matter-of-factly, "You don't have to just take that. You can tell your parents you need boundaries with her. My mom says family doesn't get to treat you badly just because they're family." The friend seemed surprised. "But won't that make your grandmother mad?" Lily shrugged. "Maybe. But being mad doesn't make her right. You deserve to be treated with respect. If she can't do that, she doesn't get unlimited access to you." I heard my own words coming out of my 12-year-old's mouth, and I felt something shift inside me. This was the victory, not the acknowledgement from the company, not Victoria losing her CEO position, not my parents' inadequate apologies. The real victory was this: my daughter had internalized lessons about self-worth and boundaries that took me 37 years to learn. Marcus, in his own way, showed similar growth. He started speaking up more at school, advocating for himself in ways he hadn't before. When a teacher made a comment that diminished his artwork, he politely but firmly said, "I'm proud of what I made." When another child tried to exclude him from a game, he didn't shrink away. He simply found other children to play with and didn't internalize the rejection as proof of his inadequacy. These were small moments, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent decades learning to shrink themselves. But to me, they were revolutionary. My children were growing up knowing something I'd never known, that their worth wasn't negotiable, that they got to decide who had access to their life, that love without respect was just control wearing a prettier name, victory. Megan realized wasn't measured in apologies extracted or acknowledgments forced, but in knowing that her children would grow up with something she never had: the unshakable certainty that their worth wasn't conditional on others' approval, and that love without respect was just another word for control. 8 months had passed since the birthday party that changed everything, and several more months since the family confrontations and revelations. I was sitting in my office one afternoon finishing notes from a client meeting when I realized I'd been approaching my own family situation with the same analytical framework I used for my professional work. The parallels were striking. Toxic organizational dynamics weren't so different from toxic family dynamics. Both relied on certain people staying silent. Both punished those who questioned the status quo. Both confused loyalty with complicity. I started writing down my thoughts, not for anyone else initially, just to process what I'd learned. But as I wrote, I recognized that these weren't just personal insights. They were universal truths about family systems, about power, about the difference between real loyalty and performative loyalty. Family loyalty, I wrote, is one of the most weaponized concepts in dysfunctional systems. I'd heard it my entire life in various forms. Don't make waves. Keep family business private. Blood is thicker than water. We protect each other. These phrases sounded noble, like they were about love and connection. But in practice, in my family at least, they'd meant something very different. Don't challenge the hierarchy. Don't question unfairness. Accept your role, and above all, protect those with power even when they abuse it. The loyalty I was expected to perform wasn't actually loyalty at all. It was complicity dressed up as virtue. Real loyalty would have looked completely different. Real loyalty would have meant my parents telling the truth in 2006, even though it was uncomfortable. Real loyalty would have meant Victoria sharing credit honestly, even though it diminished her spotlight. Real loyalty would have meant anyone defending me when I was dismissed or standing up for my children when they were humiliated. But that kind of loyalty would have required courage, and courage is much harder than silence. So the family had collectively agreed to redefine loyalty as keeping quiet about things that might embarrass us, and maintaining the illusion of harmony even when it requires someone to absorb all the dysfunction. I thought about the women in my support group, in my professional network, in my extended circles. How many of them had confused loyalty with self-sacrifice? How many had been told they were good daughters or good sisters, when what that really meant was they were convenient, easy, willing to absorb mistreatment without complaint? How many had spent decades managing other people's comfort at the expense of their own dignity? The insight that really changed me was this: you can love your family and still refuse to sacrifice yourself for their comfort. These aren't contradictory positions. They're actually necessary for any healthy relationship. I loved my parents, flawed, cowardly, guilt-ridden as they were. I'd even loved my sister once before the lies and cruelty had calcified into who she was. But loving them didn't mean I owed them my silence. It didn't mean I had to continue accepting mistreatment. It didn't mean their comfort mattered more than my children's well-being or my own sense of self. Real love, I was learning, included boundaries. It included accountability. It included the possibility of saying, "I love you and I can't have you in my life this way anymore." Those things weren't opposites. They were two parts of the same mature, honest approach to relationship. The second major lesson was harder to face because it required me to take responsibility for my own choices. For years, decades really, I'd believed my silence was noble. I'd told myself I was keeping the peace, maintaining family connections, being mature enough not to fight over every slight. I'd convinced myself that by not making demands or complaints, I was doing the right thing. But I'd been lying to myself. My silence hadn't kept the peace. It had suppressed conflict, which isn't the same thing at all. Peace means everyone is genuinely okay. Suppressed conflict means one person is absorbing all the dysfunction so others can pretend everything is fine. That's not peace. That's pressure building toward inevitable explosion. My silence had taught my sister that disrespect had no consequences. Every time she diminished me and I said nothing, I was confirming that she could treat me that way. Every time my parents favored her, and I accepted it without protest, I was teaching them that this family structure worked. I thought I was being strong by enduring, but I was actually enabling the system that hurt me. My silence had taught my parents they could avoid accountability indefinitely. They'd made a terrible choice in 2005, and every year that passed without me questioning it was another year they could tell themselves it must not have really mattered. If Megan wasn't asking about it, if Megan seemed fine, then maybe it was okay that they'd never told her the truth. My silence gave them permission to keep hiding. Worst of all, my silence had taught my children that accepting mistreatment was the price of belonging. They'd watched me smile through family gatherings where I was dismissed. They'd heard me make excuses for people who treated us badly. They'd learned from my example that when someone hurts you, you absorb it quietly and don't cause problems. That's a devastating lesson to pass to the next generation, and I'd been doing it unconsciously for years. When I finally broke my silence, not with rage or drama, but with clear boundaries and honest confrontation, I didn't destroy my family. I revealed what was already broken. And that revelation created the possibility of real repair, even if that repair looked different than I'd once hoped. This lesson resonated deeply with my therapy clients, with the women in my professional network, with people I'd known for years who were suddenly seeing their own family dynamics in a new light. How many of us had been taught that silence was maturity, that enduring was strength, that speaking up was dramatic or difficult, or proof you couldn't handle adversity. The truth was harder and more empowering. Silence in the face of injustice isn't peaceful. It's complicit. And speaking up isn't destroying relationships. It's refusing to participate in the destruction of yourself. The third and perhaps most profound realization was about success and vindication. At the beginning of this journey, I'd unconsciously measured myself against Victoria's apparent success and found myself lacking. She had the impressive career, the public recognition, the family's pride and approval. I had the nice but unremarkable career, the modest life, the absence of notice. By family standards, she was the success story, and I was the footnote. But now I understood how hollow Victoria's success had been. It was built on stolen foundation. It was maintained through constant external validation because she had no internal sense of worth. It was devoid of authentic self-knowledge because she couldn't afford to look at herself honestly. The moment someone questioned her success, her entire identity crumbled because it wasn't actually hers. My ordinary life, conversely, was built on truth. My career success was earned through my own work. My marriage was based on authentic partnership. My sense of self, hard-won though it was, didn't require anyone else's validation. I'd built everything I had, and no one could take it away because it was genuinely mine. I didn't need my family to declare me the successful daughter to replace Victoria. I didn't need them to finally see my worth. I didn't need their approval or acknowledgement or belated pride. Those things would be nice, sure, but they weren't necessary for my peace. This was perhaps the most freeing realization of all. I knew my own worth, independent of their opinion. Victoria had spent her entire life needing everyone to believe she was special. She'd organized her whole existence around external validation. But I'd learned through pain and struggle and the long journey of this past year that I didn't need anyone to tell me I had value. I knew it myself, and that knowing was enough. My vindication wasn't proving them wrong, though I had done that. It wasn't watching Victoria face consequences, though that had happened too. My real vindication was the moment I stopped caring whether my family ever fully understood what they'd done to me. Their understanding would be nice, but it wasn't required for me to move forward. I could see clearly now that I'd spent 37 years trying to earn something that should have been freely given: recognition, respect, value. I'd internalized their narrative that I had to prove myself worthy of attention, but I'd been approaching it all wrong. Worth isn't something you earn. It's something you have inherently, and the right people recognize it without you having to perform or prove or diminish yourself to make them comfortable. The women I worked with, the clients I consulted, for the friends who'd watched this journey unfold, so many of them were fighting similar battles. Not necessarily with stolen intellectual property or dramatic family fraud, but with the daily erosion of self that comes from trying to earn love that should be unconditional, seeking approval from people who will never give it, and measuring success by standards designed to ensure you always fall short. I started incorporating these insights into my professional work. When I helped companies identify toxic dynamics, I talked about the difference between real loyalty and enforced silence. When I worked with leaders on culture transformation, I discussed how silence enables dysfunction and speaking up creates possibility for genuine change. When I facilitated difficult conversations, I emphasized that conflict isn't the enemy. Suppressed conflict is the enemy. Honest disagreement handled with respect can strengthen relationships. Forced harmony built on one person's silence always eventually collapses. One evening, sitting with James after the children were asleep, I tried to articulate what had changed in me. "I'm not angry anymore," I told him. "I thought I'd be angrier once everything came out, but I'm not. I'm just free." He understood immediately. "Because you don't need anything from them anymore." I nodded. "Exactly. I don't need them to apologize better. I don't need them to fully understand what they did. I don't need Victoria to become a different person or my parents to go back in time and make better choices. I'm free because their opinions don't define my reality anymore." That freedom was the real victory. Not the acknowledgement in company records, not Victoria's fall from leadership, not my parents' guilty confessions. The victory was internal. It was the moment I stopped measuring my worth by their recognition. The moment I stopped waiting for them to validate me. The moment I realized that I could love them, maintain bounded relationships with them, or even step away entirely, and none of those choices determined my value. I determined my value, and I knew it now with a certainty I'd never had before. Some battles Megan finally understood weren't won by defeating enemies, but by refusing to let those enemies define victory, and the moment she stopped needing her family to validate her worth was the moment she became truly free, whether they ever recognized it or not. 2 years after everything changed, I found myself living a life that looked unremarkable from the outside but felt revolutionary from within. My relationship with my parents had settled into something manageable, if not warm. They saw their grandchildren quarterly visits, scheduled in advance, and still loosely supervised. We spoke on the phone occasionally, conversations that were cordial, but careful, both sides navigating around topics that might hurt. They'd never fully grasped what they'd done or why it mattered so deeply, but they'd stopped trying to minimize it, which was something. My mother sent birthday cards and Christmas presents. My father asked about my work with genuine interest. It wasn't the relationship I'd once wished for, but it was honest, and that made it more valuable than the false closeness we'd had before. Victoria and I hadn't spoken directly since that final family meeting. We exchanged brief texts when logistics required it, whose turn to bring dessert to Daniel's house, whether the kids wanted to coordinate gifts for our parents' anniversary. Nothing personal, nothing that required vulnerability. I'd heard through Daniel that she was in therapy, working through what he diplomatically called identity reconstruction. I hoped that was true, hoped she was building a sense of self that didn't require anyone else's foundation. But I didn't need to know if she succeeded. Her journey was no longer mine to witness or support. The company had stabilized under new leadership. The educational trust funds for my children had been established, matching what Victoria's children received. Company records had been corrected, my contribution acknowledged in the official history. These were practical resolutions, important, but not healing. The real healing happened in smaller, quieter ways. My children had grown into people I was genuinely proud of, not because they excelled at everything or met some external standard, but because they knew themselves. Lily, now 14, had recently told me, "I'm glad you stood up for us even though it made things harder. It showed me I'm allowed to stand up for myself too." Marcus at 10 had the kind of easy confidence I'd never possessed at his age. He was close with Daniel's family, proving that healthy relationships were possible when built on mutual respect rather than obligation. I'd channeled everything I'd learned into my work, developing a specialty in toxic organizational dynamics and family business conflicts. I wrote articles about silence, as complicity gave talks about boundaries as self-respect. My work resonated with women who saw their own stories in mine, who'd spent decades making themselves smaller. I wasn't famous, didn't want to be, but I'd found purpose in helping others navigate waters I'd nearly drowned in. On my office wall hung a quote I'd written during the hardest part. She didn't need to destroy anyone to rise. She just needed to stop shrinking herself. Clients asked about it sometimes, and I'd explain most of our battles aren't against others, they're against our conditioning to accommodate others' comfort at our own expense. This afternoon I picked up Lily from school and she was telling me some story about her friend's drama with another girl, both of us laughing at the absurdity of teenage social politics. We drove home through ordinary traffic to our ordinary house, and I felt something I couldn't have imagined 2 years ago. Peace. Not the false peace of silence and suppression, but the real peace of knowing exactly who I was and refusing to apologize for it. Some stories don't end with revenge or perfect reconciliation. They end with a woman finally understanding that her value was never contingent on anyone's recognition, and that quiet truth was more powerful than any vindication others could have offered. If Megan's story touched your heart, it's because her struggle is one so many of us understand. How many of us have stayed silent to keep the peace? How many times have we shrunk ourselves to make others comfortable? How many years did we spend waiting for someone to see our worth instead of claiming it ourselves? The most powerful lesson here isn't about revenge or even justice. It's about understanding that your value doesn't require anyone else's validation. That speaking up isn't destroying relationships, silence was destroying you. That it's never too late to set boundaries to protect your children from cycles you endured to choose dignity over acceptance. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you experienced something similar in your own family? What would you have done in Megan's position? Share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please subscribe so we can continue these conversations about the courage it takes to stop shrinking yourself and start living authentically. Your story matters too.